It is May 24th, 2017 at 8:32 a.m. This meeting is being held at Sheridan College, room TRCC 008 in the Thorn Rider Campus Center, 3059 Coffeen Avenue, Sheridan, Wyoming. With me here today from the council are Tim Flitner, Rich Fairservice, Nick Begopian, Megan Lawley, Megan Dagenfelder, and Deb Balmer. Also present are Jim Ruby, Executive Officer, Joe Girardin, and Ryan Shellhouse from the Attorney General's Office. First item on the agenda is the approval of the March 22nd, 2017 minutes. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second. Thank you. Any discussion, comments, corrections? Hearing none. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? Minutes are approved. Next is the approval of an administrative order on consent. Let's see, is there anyone from DEQ Solid Waste Division who can come forward and just chat about that? If not, that's all right, because I think we understand these. So this is an administrative order on consent, docket 17-5903. The DEQ and City of Sundance entered into a new administrative order on consent regarding the City of Sundance landfill. And this is one of those orders on consent that they do to move forward and start to get funding for closing the landfill or developing transfer stations, that sort of thing. We've seen these before. Do I have a motion to approve that order of on consent? Second?
Second.
Any discussion? All right. Hearing none, we will vote. Roll call vote. Tim?
Yeah.
Megan D?
Yes.
Megan L?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
Deb?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
I vote aye as well. So that has been approved. Next, we have an order of dismissal for docket 15-4801. Powder River Basin Resource Council requesting dismissal of petitions. And I guess I would ask, is there anyone here who might speak on that? Ms. Anderson, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. This matter has been on your docket for quite some time. You may remember the history of this petition that we brought to you. At the time, the company was in bankruptcy proceedings, and there was some issues about what we could and couldn't do during those bankruptcy proceedings. And so the case got stayed during the bankruptcy, and now the company is out of bankruptcy, has since sold its Wyoming properties to a new company, Contura Coal West, and they are now operating the Eagle Butte mine, which was the subject of our petition for review to this council. So effectively, the company and the permit that we objected to and sought your review of no longer exist. So therefore, the proceeding is effectively moot. But we did want to file what we filed with you because we wanted to draw to your attention that these problems can come back. And it's possible that, another coal company gets into bankruptcy and we're right back where we were before. So we wanted to preserve our rights to raise those objections at a later date if we needed to. So that's why we did what we did. As the case is currently stayed before you, we do ask that you lift the stay in the docket for the sole purpose of recognizing the mootness of it and dismissing it today. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any comment from the DEQ?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. DEQ filed a short filing yesterday just to inform the council that DEQ supports dismissing the case as moot. We did reserve our defenses to the extent that that was appropriate to do, but we agree it's moot and the council should lift the stay to dismiss it.
All right, thank you. Any questions from council members? So do I have a motion to dismiss docket 15-4801?
Move to lift the stay and dismiss.
Thank you. Second? Okay. Any further discussion? All right, we will vote. Roll call vote. I'll start on the other end. Rich?
Yes.
Deb?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
Megan L?
Yes.
Megan D?
Yes.
Tim? I vote aye as well. So we've approved the motion to lift the stay and dismiss. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next item on our agenda is the election of officers. So this is actually my favorite part of the agenda. Been waiting for this. Wanted to do it first thing Monday, but I told I had to wait. So now, do I have a nomination of a slate of candidates?
I'd move Megan Allen as chairman. Not doing anything.
Just showing up for a meeting for 5 minutes.
All right, so we have a nomination of a slate of candidates. Are there any other nominations? Hearing none, do I have a motion to close nominations and to cast a unanimous ballot for this slate?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Comments? Do I need a roll call vote on this, Jim?
No, you do.
All right. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay? Any abstention? None. All right. Can I turn it over to Megan Lawley now or do I have to finish off my?
I would finish off this meeting.
Okay.
This is all you need now is a motion to adjourn. Adjourn the meeting.
Is there any other business that we can take up here before we give ourselves a 20-minute break?
Are the parties here?
Is the, well, we have to wait till 9 because that's when it's closed. Yeah. Yeah, for uranium. Is there any other business, Jim?
That's it.
Good.
No, just a day full of coffee.
All right, so we will now take a break until 9 a.m. to start the rulemaking hearing. So, thank you all for attending. Good, that's it. At this time, we have the public hearing for the uranium mine rule package, docket 17-4101. I'll turn the gavel over, Councilwoman Dagenfeld.
Thank you, Dr. Bagley. Good morning. I'm Megan Dagenfelder, hearing officer for docket 17-4101. It is May 24th, 2017 at 9 o'clock in the morning. This meeting is being held at Sheridan College, room TRCC 008 in the Thorn Rider Campus Center, 3059 Coffeen Avenue, Sheridan, Wyoming. With me here today from the council, Dr. Dave Bagley, Tim Flittner, Rich Fair Service, Nick Agopian, Megan Lawley, myself, and Deb Baumer. Also present are Jim Ruby, Executive Officer, Joe Giardin, Paralegal, and Ryan Shellhouse from the Attorney General's Office. We have those on behalf of DEQ that are already seated here. So I think what we'll go ahead and do is if you could provide an introduction of how this package came about. And then your statement of principal reasons was pretty all-encompassing, but if we could go through each of the chapters and then work through the advisory board, as well as any comments from the public that we received. I'll turn it over to DEQ.
Perfect. Thanks, Chairman. So I think what we wanted to do to start off with, I think that's a great game plan, is try to give the history of how this rule package.
Oh, could you also introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, I can do that. So my name is Ryan Sharman. I'm the Uranium Recovery Program Manager. Our program is the program that's been tasked with seeking out this agreement with the NRC and navigating these waters of obtaining an agreement with the NRC. I'll let the other people at the table introduce themselves too before I start into my history of where we're at today. So.
Good morning, Councilwoman Dagenfelder, members of the council. My name is Eva Law, and I'm here today on behalf of the program. I'm with the Wyoming Attorney General's Office.
Good morning. I'm Craig Haltz. I'm with the Land Quality Division. I guess my role here is the administrative rules process and just helping it through the system.
So I would say if you have questions as I present this, or feel free to stop me and ask if I need to dive into more detail on a certain topic. Where we wanted to start is I believe it was in January, we met with the ETC to give a primer on a rule package that was going to be coming forth, which we're presenting today. I wanted to revisit just a couple slides on that, and just narratively speak about it for you guys to understand, because it's important in understanding why the rules are the way they are and why they are presented the way they are. The Atomic Energy Act, basically which governs the NRC and their structure and everything else, lays forth a program that allows states to become agreement states, which means that they can act over those radioactive materials in their individual states. There's 37 agreement states. We are seeking to become potentially the 38th. Vermont is also in the process as well. Most of these agreement states take the full bang of materials. So they take all the radioactive materials, all the responsibilities that they can through the NRC. There's some rights that are reserved just to NRC, but most states take the whole agreement. Additionally, there's another type of material which is basically unique to uranium recovery operations. Because this is kind of unique, there's actually only 4 states that have this type of an agreement with the NRC, those being Utah, Colorado, Washington, and Texas. We are unique in our process because we are only seeking this uranium recovery type material. We're not seeking the other types of material that NRC allows agreement states to seek, and it's a unique process. Oklahoma was the first to be able to show that you could take just a subcategory of material and take a small quantity of material, a subclass of material, as long as it created a clean regulatory scheme. And we've kind of modeled our agreement based off of Oklahoma. I have the date. In July of last year, so July 5th, 2016, the NRC, to their commission, presented this idea that Wyoming wanted to seek this limited agreement over these specific materials. The commission at the NRC basically came back and said they agreed on the process and that Wyoming could seek this limited agreement. And I'll read this language from that paper, and they title their papers, just for your edification, they call them SECI papers, and the number on that is SECI paper 160084. But it states that Wyoming would only assume regulatory authority over the possession and use of source material involved in the extraction and concentration of uranium or thorium in source material and ores at milling facilities, and the management and disposal of byproduct material as defined in section 22. So that is the type of material that we're assuming. We're assuming a very limited scope. Okay? This has never been done before with the NRC. We are the first to navigate this process just for that type of material. Because of such, it has caused we don't fit the cookie cutter mold the NRC is used to for agreement states. There's some items that are unique to our program that we had to address. There's also some items that we don't necessarily need because it's not pertinent to the limited scope of our agreement. So we've been in this process for over a year now, working with the NRC to draft regulations and a program that would meet the intent of this limited scope. We started in October 26, 2016. We put together a rule package for them, or a draft application, and that went to them in October 26th. Additionally, before this, I should back up a little bit. We went with the advisory boards and we have passed through all of our rules through them, at which point those had all passed through our advisory boards, plus our programmatic items such as how we're going to run our program, et cetera, had all gone, was all included in this draft application. Based on, and just to show the uniqueness of this, this program, you know, one, it's unique for Wyoming in the fact that we have not sought like a primacy type program since, you know, the 70s or 80s. It's been a while since we've sought this type of agreement with our federal partners. Additionally, it's unique to the NRC in the fact that it doesn't fit the typical mold. And I think it's expressed in this. If you look at the October 26th draft application, per NRC guidance, it states that typically they have comments back to the state within 9 weeks. If you look at our process, from the time that we submitted it, it was 26 weeks for us to get those comments back. So I think that adequately represents why, you know, that it is unique, and NRC, you know, this is a new review scheme for them as well. That is why, you know, we, as you've seen, we've been slated to be coming to the EQC a number of different times, but we've been pushing it back because we've been waiting for that review by NRC. We finally have those. We have those comments. We'll address some of those comments today that pertain to the rules. We'll only address those comments here that pertain to the rules. There's some other ones that involve our program, but for the aspects of the rules, that's what we'll try and cover today. We've tried to be very transparent in our rulemaking process. You know, all these chapters went to the advisory board. Also, if you look at our public comment period on these rules, just for the EQC alone, they were out for public comment for 91 days. Additionally, if you take into consideration all the time that we spent with the advisory boards, it's much, much greater than that. Each chapter went out for public comment as we developed them, and then they also went out for public comment as a whole. So the whole rule packet went together out for public comment. As far as the process of where we're at, in the primer that we related to you guys in January, we outlined a timeline that we were holding ourselves to. And I wanted to just briefly talk about where we're at with that. You know, as we've developed rules, things of that nature, the intent has always been to try and get a final application to the NRC, kind of the third quarter, fourth quarter timeframe of 2017, which would put us about, you know, we were shooting for the August timeframe, end of August timeframe to submit this final application. In the final application, the rules have to be finalized, the policies and procedures of our program need to be finalized, the hiring of our program needs to be in place, everything needs to be in place for that. and as far as how we're meeting that time frame, everything is lining up fairly well. We have the staff of our program in place. We have the training. They're undergoing extensive training to meet NRC standards. We have the policies and procedures that have been developed and we're training, and we should be able to meet that deadline. One important piece in this, though, however, and part of the reason why we're here today is we need to finalize our rule package. And, originally, and I think we can still meet those deadlines. As we'll go through today, what I want to do, I'll kind of just briefly talk on it, but then I'll go through each of the rules and talk about them individually. And then we'll go back to the comments. But we received a numerous amount of comments. From NRC's standpoint, there was roughly about 43 comments pertaining to the regulations. Overall on our program, there was over 110 comments that we have to address. A lot of those, as we go through these, will be very minor, changing ands to ors or things of that nature, but we'll try and address each of those changes. We also received a number of different comments from different interest groups as well, both Uranium Watch and PRBRC, and we'll go through those as well. We're grateful for those comments. One thing that we will, as we go through this, that we want to recommend is, we want to present all those changes and the rules as they are today. But because of the changes that occurred, and as I'll get into Chapter 10, some issues that has arose as of this week with Chapter 10, we recommend that potentially after this meeting, we put it out for public comment just to be transparent again. And then at the next meeting, we potentially come just to rule on that package. Okay. So I'll go through the chapters real quick, starting with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is kind of sets our standard for, how things will be outlined, what units we're going to be using, setting forth the definitions, things of that nature. And this is just I don't want to go through the chapter page by page, but just general topics of what those chapters cover. So in here, what you'll see is a number of different definitions. The definitions make up the majority of this chapter. How NRC regulates or reviews state regulations is fairly important. They compare us to a standard, what they refer to as compatibility and adequacy. Adequacy is that our program has the necessary elements in order to protect public health and safety. The compatibility is to make a uniform program across the nation, so one state's not doing something different than another state for things that are very important to the NRC. So definitions are important and have different compatibility classes based on their pertinent to the national scheme. So something, for example, like airborne radioactivity area, which is just right there, is very important, and they want that to be a standard definition across the nation. And so what they'll have is this will be considered a compatibility A, which means that the state has to adopt those definitions by verbatim. So word for the national standard. Additionally, some and then there's another compatibility requirement that basically is verbatim, which would be a compatibility B. And then there's compatibility C and D, which C, basically we have to have rules that meet that intent. And then D is compatibility requirements that are left for the state to decide, okay? So those are throughout, and that's what we've been under review with the NRC. All these have been vetted by the NRC and meet those compatibility requirements and adequacy requirements as stated and as written currently, with the additional changes that we'll discuss in a minute. If you we're going to move on to Chapter 2. And I'll just say, there's some of these items in here that we have to have. Some of these things are just, outlining the units, the definitions, some of the items that set the precedent for the rest of our program. I guess one item before I jump to Chapter 2, I'm just flipping through. If you go to Section 11 real quick, Craig, on Chapter 1. There are exemptions that we are required to have per federal law. These exemptions are for our type of material and for our limited scope of agreement. We have to provide for these exemptions for some of these federal facilities. So if we ever had a DOE facility in our state, similar to kind of Idaho with the Idaho National Laboratory, we would not be regulating them or licensing them. They would be exempt from our regulations and would fall under the federal scheme. So there's some of those types of items that we have to provide those exemptions for, and those are outlined again in Chapter 1. Okay. So moving on to Chapter 2, this outlines our inspection, enforcement, and penalties. There's nothing new that DEQ doesn't currently do that's presented in this chapter. Basically, it's preserving those rights that DEQ currently does for their other licensees, that our program can fit that same mold. Additionally, it allows for us to inspect those facilities and be on those properties to inspect those facilities. So that's kind of what's outlined in this chapter. And I should mention too, sorry, I'm going to jump back a little bit. There, in the comments to rules that we presented, because we had to change definitions here or delete a definition there, some of the numbering of like the definitions and in the other sections, if numbering changed per se, we did not represent that with red line strikeout because we didn't want to make a messy version for you guys to see. So, just understand that those kind of revisions have been made and are not necessarily presented in red and white and red and blue changes. Okay. Chapter 3 basically outlines our radiation protection standards. Most of this is going to be based off of 10 CFR 20. Most of this is going to be compatibility A. In order to create a uniform regulatory scheme, what we chose to do was incorporate these sections by reference. So 10 CFR 20 is incorporated by reference. The provisions within 10 CFR 20 that are not applicable or that are reserved for the NRC are excluded by section. So if you look at item B under section 4, you see all those numbers that are listed below. Those are all exemptions of the 10 CFR 20 regulations that are not being incorporated because they're reserved to the NRC or are not applicable. One change which we'll get to is the 2014-01, 1402, 1403, 1404, and 1405, which is referred to as 10 CFR 20 subpart E. As we get to the comments, you'll see this was a comment per NRC that we exclude these sections as well because they refer to, they specifically exclude in the regulations, if you go back to it, the uranium milling facilities. And so we have removed those items. Okay. Chapter 4 deals with our licensing. This is our equivalent of a 10 CFR subpart 40 requirement. We did not incorporate this by reference in the fact that, and I guess I should back up a little bit and give the history behind this chapter a little bit too. So the whole reason why Wyoming is seeking this agreement is because there was a dual jurisdictional issue. We have a permit to mine process, which the people in Wyoming are familiar with, that we govern these in situ and uranium recovery facilities. A lot of what we were regulating was overlap with the NRC regulations. There was items where both agencies were looking at the same thing. The legislature, it was presented to the legislature that we seek out an agreement such that we could remove some of those duplications. Because of such, we have a process in place currently. We have a permit to mine process. What this agreement does is it brings in a new piece, which is a source material license to handle the radioactive material side of it. Because these two processes exist, to make it an efficient regulatory scheme, Chapter 4 outlines how those two processes will merge. We don't expect, because there's this dual overlap between a permit to mine and a source material license, that you have to submit a separate application for both processes. We're allowing it to be combined, but because there's nuances with the source material license, there's new information and new requirements that will be required to be placed into that permit to mine. That being said, as far as an action, the LQD will still issue, once we become an agreement state, a permit to mine and will still issue a source material license. There'll be two separate processes based off the same application. So this chapter kind of outlines those standards, if you will. Okay, so it outlines what's required for an application. There's some sections within this document that are incorporated by reference. More importantly, I think the most important incorporation by reference is the 10 CFR 40 Appendix A requirements, which dictate kind of some of the reclamation and decommissioning standards for these uranium recovery facilities. A lot of this material, or a lot of these requirements in this 10 CFR 40 Appendix A, again, are compatibility A, and we're required to have those basically verbatim. And in order to preserve that, we incorporated those by reference. One thing that is of note, as we go through this too, these govern, all the uranium recovery operations that we have within the state. And for edification, so you understand these rules, that covers both in situ uranium recovery, the conventional mill recovery, so basically taking ore, crushing it, and processing at your plant. And then also the decommissioning and what is referred to as the Title I and Title II. We would not have jurisdiction over the Title I, but over the Title II sites, which have undergone decommissioning, and basically because of federal law referred to as the uranium or UMTRCA, we'll just leave it at the acronym for now. Basically that provides for these Title II sites, so these conventional mills that have undergone decommissioning, that they'll be transferred to the state or the Department of Energy for long-term care and maintenance. So basically they'll be in charge of the state and make sure that they are maintaining the site for after the operation, after the licensee is left, so forever after that point. So we have this, there is some nuances in this chapter that talk and are specific for those type of Title II sites, okay? Again, it talks about through this process, filing an application, potentially where there would be exemptions from this process, and then talks about in this chapter as well, public participation, how the public participates in the process, operational requirements, what are they required to do on an annual basis as far as reports, things of that nature that are unique just to the source material license, and then what happens as these licenses terminate and expire. It's of note, these are usually typically, they do have a 10-year window usually on these licenses, at which point at the 10-year time frame they renew and apply for renewal of that license, and they're given in 10-year time frames. And that is a little bit of a change in process or new because of this source material license that you'll undergo this renewal process. Again, it talks about amendments and modifications to a license, public notice, decommissioning requirements, and then the decommissioning plan, and then going forward. Chapter 5, as we jump to the next chapter, these outline kind of the responsibilities that these types of facilities have to workers, what rights they have to preserve to workers, what information they have to present to workers, things of that nature. Again, this is a federal requirement that we incorporated by reference, which would be 10 CFR 19. Moving on to chapter 6, which is the financial assurance chapter. In essence, what this chapter does is basically those same financial assurance requirements that are set forth for other LQD operations, basically makes it applicable to our program as well. There is some slight differences as you read this section. One is that because of the federal requirements, these uranium recovery operations, the in situ conventionals, things of that nature, are not allowed to self-bond, and that's been preserved in this chapter. They're not allowed to self-bond. Additionally, you'll find language that talks about establishing that long-term, we talked about the Department of Energy taking control of the Title II sites once decommissioning has been done. There is some financial assurances that in place to cover the costs of maintaining those sites for after the site has been transferred to the Department of Energy. So you'll see some items in this chapter that talk about long-term care fees and things of that nature to cover that long-term care and maintenance. Moving on to, and again, most of this, it's all in line with what currently LQD handles and does as far as financial assurance and record keeping of that financial assurance. Chapter 7 outlines our fees. I'm going to spend a little more time just kind of briefly describing how this process will work for the fees, because I think this is of interest for the public and for those involved. Our program, once we become an agreement state, will be completely funded by those that we regulate. And how we propose to do this is outlined in Chapter 7. There's what we'll end up doing, and the basis of this program is our budget is set by legislature. We're assigned a certain amount of money that we're supposed to have to run our program or budget for our program. The way that we presented our fee structure is such that we will collect that full amount at the beginning of the year for our program. So the beginning of the year, we'll collect that amount of money, and it will be in the beginning, the number of operators or licenses that we have, it'll be distributed over those licensees. Additionally, there's provisions in this chapter that talk about as a historical record or as they demonstrate operational history after 2 years, that amount of money they pay at the beginning of the year will be represented on what they paid in the last 2 years. What will happen then after that point that we receive that money is we will account for the time that we spent, and I'll back up a little bit. There's the time that we spent on that project will be accounted for, whether that be inspections or license review or things of that nature will be coded to that project. And at the end of the year, along with our indirect costs, so being, overhead, administration, paper, travel, training, as well as other administrative costs such as HR, accounting for our program, will be tracked and distributed back to the licensees at the end of the year. In essence, what we're saying is at the beginning of the year, we'll collect X amount of money, and then we'll track our costs for the individual operator. And at the end of the year, we're either going to send an invoice because it cost us more resources, or we're going to basically refund because you didn't cost as much at the end of the year. In essence, we're going to collect our budgeted amount from the legislature every year at the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year, we're going to redistribute and true up according to actual costs. And so that's kind of what it lays out here. There's some terms that are unique. We talk about site-specific direct costs, which are basically our time spent on the program or on the licensee. So inspections, license review, things of that nature. Non-site specific direct costs. So this is basically our training, paper supply, traveling, any work that we do on guidance, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also an indirect cost, which is going to cover the things of such as HR for our program, accounting, things of that nature, and outlines how we'll account for those items. One thing, how we'll distribute the non-site specific direct costs is it's a proportion of how much our direct costs are. So if company X requires 30% of our time and resources, they will incur 30% of that indirect cost. It's proportional to how much of that direct cost they take from us. And so that's kind of how it'll go. Additionally, in here, it talks about application fees. As we've worked through this process, one thing that was important is, that when people apply for a source material license, that they're serious in their intent and they have skin in the game, if you will. And so there's a $100,000 application fee when they apply for a license with our program. That $100,000 is used for our resources to be spent on that project. So basically that $100,000 pays for our review of that application and our time spent on that applicant's application. If we spend more than that $100,000 reviewing that individual application, we will require an additional $100,000 to cover the cost. Now, if we get to the point where we finish the application and we haven't spent set amount of resources, those would then be credited back to the company for their use, whether that be to their fees that they have to pay as part of being part of our program or to the actual company. Okay. Additionally, in this chapter, we outline, because we're doing this true up, that you have to, companies are going to be billed according to what they use of our resources, that there has to be a minimum amount that we charge. So they basically have to stay on our books. And in this chapter, we just put $1,000 minimum, just so that they're in our books, that we keep track of them and we're accounting for them. That's not saying that we just don't want a company to come back and they didn't use our resources or time that year. We want to make sure that they're on the books. And this could be applicable for those sites, for example, that undergo decommissioning and have had all the surface reclamation done, and maybe they're just working on establishing the groundwater criteria. They're kind of just waiting to get data. There may be times where the resources to our department are very little, but we want to make sure they're at least accounted for on that. Okay. Chapter 8 is a new term that the NRC has successfully operated under with their licensees for a number of different years. It outlines what is referred to as a SERP process, so SERP, which is basically a safety environmental review panel. And what this process does is it allows for operators for minor changes in their plant to make changes without sending information to the DEQ formally that don't affect the process. And I guess it's best to explain per example. Because of this new program, one of the things, I think the best way to show this is we have to ensure that there are radiation protection staff on site and that they have the authorities to do their job and protect the workers from the effects of radiation. So this involves, in an application, licensees submitting charts, organizational charts of how they're structured, things of that nature. As time goes on, a lot of companies restructure and change, and the organizational chart may change. This process enables them to make those changes to those organizational charts, and then at the time of inspection, we review these decisions and basically decide if and review it to make sure that they were in line with the standards that are set forth in this chapter. So it allows the operators to basically make these minor changes that are important for their process to continue, rather than sending formal amendments into the DEQ every time they have to make a staffing change or things of that nature. We also have to, if we come back and we review at inspection that they did not meet the requirements of this chapter and that they did something or made a change that should have been an amendment to the application, they would in essence at that point be in non-compliance and potentially be an NOV for not fulfilling the requirements of this chapter. Okay. Moving on to chapter 9. This has to deal with the transportation aspect of our program. Because we are shipping material that's radioactive, there's a lot of technical requirements that we have to set forth, that we have to ensure that the operator is preparing packages that are in accordance with DOT, and also when they receive packages that they're in accordance with DOT regulations. And these kind of set forth the standards. For the most part, what we did with these chapters is there's a federal requirement that has very little lateral movement for the state. So basically we're required to accept these by standards. So we basically incorporated these by reference to preserve those standards. Lastly, we're going to move to Chapter 10. This chapter provides for what is referred to as a general license. A general license, in this essence, is basically allows, I'll back up a little. There's two types of licenses that we'll have. A specific license where they actually have to send in an application and meet the requirements of our Chapter 4 and all those other requirements. In the general license, and this is how, I guess the best way to explain a general license is as you go into your homes, for example, with your smoke detectors, you have a radioactive americium source in your smoke detector that allows how it works. When you go and apply or buy a smoke detector, you don't apply for a license with the NRC. Basically, you are allowed to have that under what is referred to as a general license and put those in your home because it's been determined that it's inherently safe for you to have that small quantity of radioactive material. Now, with our items, we have to preserve for general licenses for two items. One is for these sites that undergo decommissioning. So a conventional mill that underwent decommissioning, at the time of transfer, we transfer to the Department of Energy for long-term care and maintenance. At that time frame, we issue a general license to them for residual radioactivity, which means there may be some residual radioactivity in the soil or wherever. And then we transfer it to the DOE. We then, in essence, don't necessarily regulate them. They have a general license. Now, the way the general licenses are enforced is you don't necessarily have to apply for a general license, but if you do not meet the terms of what is in the general license, so quantity, the amount, what specific item, then at that point you're in non-compliance and we can take enforcement actions. But if you are in guidance or within this chapter, you would not necessarily be subject to enforcement. That makes sense. So we have to have it for those Title II sites. But there's also, for small quantities of uranium, there's also general licenses that are issued per the NRC. And this could be, for academical purposes, maybe even for testing at a laboratory. So if an operator wants to send a small quantity of material for analysis, they can do such under a general license, and that laboratory potentially doesn't have to have a specific license to analyze that material. And so it's important that we preserve that right with the general licenses. We initially just incorporated the federal requirement. As we'll get to earlier, the NRC suggested that we remove that incorporation by reference and move towards actually spelling out those requirements. So that's what you see in red is basically verbatim from the federal requirement. But the reason we had to change that is because some of the language within the federal requirement talked about material that was outside of our limited scope. Okay, so again, remember, we're only taking a small scope of radioactive material from the NRC. This section may have talked about material that was outside of what we were seeking. And to remove that conflict, that's why we had to basically incorporate that federal requirement, removing those references to the other types of materials in order to remove the conflict. What has been brought up recently, and this was as of 2 days ago, is there's questions within the NRC whether they want to preserve the right for enforcement on general licenses or have us as a state issue the general licenses. The opinion of DEQ at this point is that NRC is not able to relinquish that responsibility, that the state would have to do the general licenses, because typically how NRC has operated, and we can look back at the past, is they have given agreements for a character of material. So you have jurisdiction over this character of material. In the past, other states have tried to exclude sites, basically saying, we want this material, but we want NRC to retain X or Y. And basically NRC's commission has come back and said, you cannot exclude sites. You have to take either the whole character of material or none. And so while NRC is discussing this, we have proposed, putting these general licenses in, but in essence, and I think that's the way that we're going to go, But because NRC is still unsure on this, and this is why we mentioned before, DEQ, as we go through these comments, feels it's our recommendation, because there's unsurety with the NRC, and also because there's a number of different changes that we've incorporated based on public comment, which we'll review next, that to be transparent to the public and also ensure that NRC comes to a decision, we would recommend that this goes out for an additional public comment, and then we did make a decision at the next EQC meeting that we have to go to, a special meeting. Yep. So I am going to move to the comments unless I have other questions that people want to ask before I move to comments. Yeah.
Concerning officer, just that, you got, is there a 15 licensed mines right now?
There are roughly, I think that'd be about pretty close. I think there's about 7 to 8 operating licenses. There's about 6 of these other licenses that are basically under decommissioning and have had all the reclamation done, things of that nature. So I think that'd be about pretty close.
Because I was just trying to figure out how you recoup the 1.6
Right.
million, 100,000.
Yep. And I'll tell you kind of just as a understanding how the 1.6 came about. When they were first seeking out this agreement, they looked at NRC costs and what they were operating at. In essence, what's going to occur the way the state is operating is it's going to be a significant cost savings to operators, roughly 40 to 50% of what NRC was charging. And so, these fees will, you're right, 15, 14, it's going to be in hundreds of thousands of dollars for operating licensees. But that is smaller than what they're used to paying to their federal regulators currently.
And one other thing, I know there was a comment, I think, that you had made, talked about a large, a mine license, that they got several licenses grouped into that.
Mm-hmm.
They're operating under one, and then smaller mines or other mines are operating.
Yep.
How do you?
I think,
large license versus a small license.
right, and there's 2 ways that we account for that. In the beginning, because we have no ability, basically an operating license, company X that has multiple sites under one license and company Y that only has a small operation under one license will pay that first initial fee will be the same, right? Over time, however, because that larger site requires more of our resources, that's how they recuperate the cost. But then as we go forward with our program and get experience, we have built in here, after you can establish 2 years of operating history, that's the fee that you're paying at the beginning of the year. But because we're starting at a snapshot in time, we just said, we'll start equal footing at first. And then over time, everything should work out the way it's supposed to.
Thank you.
And one other quick question on that. So do you have a timeline for when the program will be self-sustaining?
Yes, so we, again, we're trying to submit this final application August of this year, at which point NRC would take about a year of review is their guidance, what they say. So we'd be 3rd quarter, 4th quarter getting the agreement, at which point we'd be self-sustaining. So once we get the agreement, we'll collect the fees for our budget and then we'll go forth from there. But we're not going to collect the fees until we get that agreement and get that regulatory authority.
Okay. And then the renewal process, you had mentioned it was roughly 10 years. I mean, is that a set?
The licenses are good for 10 years. What usually happens currently with NRC, and I imagine will happen with the DEQ as well, is at that 10-year time frame, they'll undergo renewal. Because of the review and processes, it may extend past that 10-year mark, but they'll be operating under the old license, under the agreement that renewal is in the process. Does that make sense? Yep. And then at that point, the license would be issued for another 10 years.
Any other questions at this time?
Yeah. Are the direct and license cost amounts similar? Are the direct and license costs similar to other states? I mean, I'm assuming you came up with this not just out of thin air, but you looked at what other states were doing.
It's a little different than what other states are doing. For example, if you look at like Utah, where they have basically one operating site and then they have a low-level waste site. They require their operators to pay a monthly fee, and they pay that monthly fee at given amounts. But if we're talking about like the X amount of dollars, yes, it's in line with all the other states, but how we recuperate that is a little different. We're going to bill them for their direct costs and recuperate our costs at the beginning of the year. That's a little different than what the other states do. The other states, Texas and Utah, have kind of a set fee that you have to pay every year regardless of what you're doing.
And then the second is, if we put this back out for comments and it goes back to the NRC, last time it took 20 weeks, which is, almost half a year. Are we going to be back? You're saying we should meet at the next meeting. I don't see that being done by August if we have to wait another 20 weeks.
What I would say is the only item that is going to be out for review is the Chapter 10 small items. We should have resolution with that fairly quickly. I would say within a week or two.
Okay.
And then additionally, to meet that August timeframe, again, remember that we are trying to meet these deadlines in order for us to get that agreement third quarter, fourth quarter, 18. Additionally, as you remember, the stand-up of this program currently is under general fund, right? So that is how we're being funded. So there is, because of the situation in Wyoming, pressures to get this agreement through. And to do such, we are very conscientious of this, and we're trying to move this along as fast as we can. We've made great progress. At the rate we're going, it's going to be about 3.5 years, 3 years about from when we started this process. NRC recommends and says that it usually takes 5 years. So we've cut a bunch of time off this process, and we've been accelerating it. In order to meet those deadlines that we've set, in order to preserve those and respect our drain on that general fund, we need to get the final agreement out roughly in the August timeframe. And in order to do that with this group, you mentioned, yes, we're putting it in tight schedule in order to meet that requirement. We may require a special meeting, EQC meeting, to come back and just finalize these rules in order to meet those deadlines and to make sure that we are not a drain on that general fund and we can get through and meet this aggressive schedule.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the council? Okay,
Okay.
do you want to continue on to the advisory board and other comments you received?
Yeah, so, and Chairman and Commission members, as far as the advisory board, what would you like me to touch on? The comments we received during the advisory board
Right,
or
it
just
seemed
the
pretty
process?
simple. It was just a lot of grammatical changes. Is that correct?
So, Chairman and Commission members, the advisory board we met with on each individual chapter. So each individual chapter, as we drafted it and we went to the advisory board for comments, and it was a pretty good process that we did a lot of work and we covered a lot of ground. We got through that process. In essence, the public comment we got from the advisory board level was minimal at best. We worked with WMA for passing these rules through, and they gave lots of input. But other comments that we received through that process was very minimal. No formal comments were submitted during that advisory board process. So we moved through that process. In September, I believe we finished the advisory board discussions on our chapters, moved through with those. As we met with the advisory board, they were very well informed about this process, that this was kind of, because we have this federal requirement, there's this back and forth between us, and our group, and the NRC trying to meet these compatibility and adequacy. I believe it was the intent or understanding of the advisory board that there may be minor changes based on these NRC reviews of our regulations that would occur, and that we would capture those at a meeting such as these EQC meetings. And that, from that standpoint, I'll probably start moving into those comments if that's all right. So we received comments from 5 different parties. We received them from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the bulk of them. Also, we received comments from the Wyoming Mining Association, Powder River Basin Resource Council, Wyoming Association of Professional Archaeologists, and Uranium Watch. We'll take each of these comments and go through them, and I'm not going to read those comments. I might just summarize them for you and what the main topics are, and then I'll tell you how we address those comments. So moving to the NRC comments. So if you go to NRC comment number 5, this had to do with, again, remember that we have structures in place that govern the uranium recovery operations. We have statutes that define our mining processes. One of the concerns the NRC has is that they've reviewed our package is looking at those Environmental Quality Act and looking and seeing in, for example, like the Solid and Hazardous Waste Division, something that refers to radioactive material. They want to review that and dissect that and what that means. This comment kind of is in that essence. In our land quality land quality regulations, they have a definition of operations which excludes the Nuclear Regulatory Commission licensed area. And NRC was concerned what that meant and what that implied for our program. From our standpoint, when we become an agreement state, they're no longer a Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they're a state area. And so it's not a concern to the program by this definition. However, to be transparent and to address their concerns, we propose the definition of operation, which basically mirrors the statute definition without that exemption to the NRC restricted area. Okay, so that was one change we made per recommendation by the NRC, and by doing such, it meets and satisfies their concern. And I should note that all these comments and responses that we've presented here have been reviewed by the NRC. We've met with them, and the proposed changes that we are proposing meet and satisfy any concern that they have. Okay, so on comment 13. One of the issues that we have, is by taking the small set of material, we're very limited in our agreement, right? We mentioned that before. We're unique, we're special, we're taking a very small sector. Commercial laboratories that are in the state deal with our operators and deal with this type of material. They also have additional licenses. They have a license that has additional radionuclides and different constituents that NRC regulates. In order to prevent a dual jurisdiction over license or laboratories in the state, we have excluded laboratories from our control. So we would not be regulating that small entity of material that they have, and NRC would be regulating the rest under that same license. And in order to prevent or remove that dual jurisdiction, we added some language in our Chapter 1, Section 3. And this language is in statute. We underwent statute changes in 2017, and those are, and the same exemption is included in those statute changes. But NRC was concerned it was not in our regulations, this exclusion, and so we added that to Chapter 1, Section 3. Where it just says, or independent or commercial laboratory facilities that possess, use, or accept byproduct or source material as what is not governed by our regulations. So this excludes that dual jurisdiction in laboratory space. Comment 17, this has a little bit to do with the in situ mining process. When they apply for a license, they apply for a number of different areas that are defined by well field, for example. And they may have multiple well fields that last for numerous years, but they don't necessarily develop all their well fields at one time. They may develop one well field, use that well field, move to the next, et cetera, et cetera. Because of this, there's a lag in their decommissioning. They may be operating well field number 2, and well field number 1 will be undergoing decommissioning at that point. In order to remove those sites from their, or to decommission and release those sites back to the public, we allowed for what is referred to as a partial site release. So as they do the decommissioning and reclamation, and they're still operating further, we can do sections of lands for reclamation and decommissioning. This would all have to be approved by the NRC. And we spelled that out in our chapter, but the concern is they wanted to know how we would go about making those decisions and how NRC would buy off on those decisions. And that is why we added the language we did in on comment number 40 or 49 and 29. that we would follow NRC guidance that they provide, which is a document SA 900, which basically outlines how we would do that process. So we're just committing ourselves in our regulations that when we go to a partial site release, we will follow this NRC guidance. Comments 32 and 33 have to deal with changing an and to an or. NRC was very concerned that we maintain what's in the Atomic Energy Act. This was, again, because of the uniqueness of what we're doing. Some mistakes were made. You know, if you look back to the commission decision that was issued by the NRC, they talked about uranium and thorium. When we compared that to the Atomic Energy Act, which is their governing language, it says uranium or thorium. And so they requested that we change it back to the governing legislation rather than the commission paper. So that's what's reflected in comments, in those comments. In comment 34, there was concerns that we did not have retention periods for important information for decommissioning, such as spills, things like that. We responded that we do have those requirements, but it was incorporated by reference, and we incorporated 10 CFR 40.36. And those cover the concerns that NRC had, and they're fine with that revision, or they're fine with our response on that. The comment 35, basically our enforcement chapter, they were concerned that unlawful was different than non-licensee, and they wanted us to include the term non-licensee within that, within our regulations. In order to move this process along, we felt that didn't change our rules, but in order to satisfy NRC, we included that term non-licensee for the unlawful possession, so that we were clear and NRC would be okay with our regulations. NRC comments 36 and 38. This had to deal, the concern with this is for self-identification. We wanted to create a system in which our licensees are communicating to us, and if there's issues at their plants, they're communicating with us and talking to us. We wanted to provide an incentive for self-identification of items. And other states have successfully do this as well. This language is taken directly from Utah regulation. Colorado has similar measures in their regulations as well. One concern that was brought up was how management controls would be included as far as not being, so basically if in this section there's the act of God clause. If something was outside of the operator's control, they potentially, bring it forth to us, and it's not necessarily cited for an NOV. One of the items that was listed was for management controls, and after analyzing it and talking with NRC, we were unsure how management controls should be listed in that as well. And in order to get resolution and in order to get to move on in this process, we deleted those management controls, which we don't think will change the rule or the intent that we were trying to accomplish. NRC comments 37 and 47 are just formatting errors that we needed to correct. We corrected those. Comments 39 and 40 and 40 as well, or 39 and 40. They wanted us to change, so if we go back, the regulations throughout, not in just in one place, talks about the department may issue licenses to receive, title to, acquire, own, possess, transfer, offer, or receive for transport or deliver any licensed material. So they wanted us to add the verb use along with those verbs that we were including there. We thought originally that it was included, that it was inherent by doing any of those activities you could be using. But in order to satisfy NRC's concerns, we added the word use throughout the regulations when we listed out those verbs. Comment 41 has to deal with the Title I and Title II sites. There's an organization that's called the CRCBD, the Conference of Radiation Professionals. They give out recommended chapters that meet the agreement state's purposes. So we took language from that in order to meet the requirements of Chapter 4. After review by NRC, they felt that the language that was presented by that organization was incorrect. And so in essence, to satisfy that comment, we deleted the paragraph that talked about that in Chapter 4, Section 2B. And in essence, what we did is we incorporated the federal requirement by reference. It has to deal with Title II sites and how those Title II sites are handled. It's very confusing language, and we wanted to, in order to make it clear, that's why we went through the IBR process. Comments 42 and 56 from the NRC had to deal with transportation and deliberate misconduct in regards to transportation. We had the deliberate misconduct portions of the federal regulations incorporated by reference, so it's just a matter of pointing the NRC where those items were located. Comment 43. This was a compatibility issue. In drafting the regulations, we left off a sentence in regards to Australian obligated source material. It's a federal requirement A, so we had to have this language verbatim to NRC's, and so we added the additional language so that it met NRC's language verbatim. The next comments on comment 44. Had to deal with common defense and security. So common defense and security of radioactive material is something that NRC will retain authority over. And they asked us as we went through our rules to remove any reference to common defense and security, because that will be a federal jurisdictional item that they will cover. So we went through and made those changes. NRC comment 45, this has to deal with our application process. We listed, an application will be granted, or license will be granted if they meet the requirements of Chapter 4 and all the different requirements. If you look at I through V, it listed the requirements there. The NRC was concerned, even though financial assurances are listed in Chapter 4, that you have to meet those financial assurances. They wanted to make sure that they had to meet the Chapter 6 financial assurance as well. So we added the additional. The applicant has satisfied the requirements of Chapter 6 of these rules to satisfy the NRC's concerns. Comment 46, one concern, so NRC has currently in their regulations that their financial assurances have to be, and this is in 10 CFR 40 Appendix A, that they have to have a standby trust for their financial assurances. The state does not have a standby trust for our operations. What has currently happened is NRC has granted exemptions from that requirement to the operators in the state of Wyoming, formally in a letter that states, yeah, you don't have a standby trust, but the state system using a fiduciary fund is a similar process and protects and acts as a standby trust. The comment in reference here is, we just have to demonstrate to the NRC that that it is similar to a standby trust. The concern NRC has is that if financial assurance, if there was a forfeiture, that the money that's forfeited is tied to the individual site and cannot be earmarked or moved to a different site for reclamation. So if company Y has a shortfall, you can't take from company X's financial assurance to perform the reclamation. And we feel very comfortable that the state system is such that that does not occur, that the financial assurances are reserved to the individual site. Comment 50, again, when we're talking about the long-term care and monitoring fees, so basically when the Department of Energy assumes a site after everything's been decommissioned and reclaimed, the NRC will approve that cost. So the NRC will say, this is the cost that we think it will cost us to for the DOE to maintain the site forever and always. Comment 48 and 51. This had a deal, remember when we went to Chapter 3, subpart E, which is 1401 through 1404, there was language in that excludes uranium milling operations, so we just removed reference to those sections, and that satisfies NRC's concerns. Moving on, again, when we terminate a license, we have to demonstrate to the NRC that we followed the processes that were set forth in regulations and prepare a package to the NRC that the company has met those decommissioning and reclamation obligations, at which point they will review that package and concur with our processes. And NRC was concerned in this section that, and this is in chapter 4, or chapter 6, section 7A, that NRC, when we go to that termination, has approved the department's determination. Again, it's just clarifying language. It's not something that changes the substance of what we were doing. It's again, just clarifying that NRC does have to concur with our process. Comment 53, one concern that we've worked out with the NRC is because of the unique aspect of our agreement, we don't have reciprocity requirements, really. Reciprocity is a big deal for NRC and other agreement states because you have people that go across state borders. The best example of this would be a radiographer that's looking at piping for maybe oil and gas or other operations, maybe licensed in the state of New Mexico, but do work in the state of Idaho. The agreement states program requires that you have that recognition of that license by another agreement state. With uranium recovery operations, because of the magnitude of them and the nature of them, there's not really that transboundary movement of a license. But in order to satisfy NRC's requirements for this, we have put into our regulations this recognition of other agreement states if the need ever arose. We don't foresee that ever occurring, but it's more of a satisfy the NRC's concerns and move the process along. Comment 54 has to do with how we deal with indirect costs. These being the administration, like HR, accounting for the department. This is a accounting term. We explained this to the NRC and they were satisfied with our fee structure. Comment 55, again, remember the process that I talked about with the SERP, the Safety Environmental Review Panel. NRC governed this and applied this to industry by guidance. So they have guidance documents that outline this process. Because we're not the NRC and that we need these processes intact, that's why we created the Chapter 8 regulation that provides this. NRC would prefer that we follow what they do, but it's a recommendation and the state is allowed to do and act as they wish on this item, and we will retain that Chapter 8 requirement, and NRC is fine with that. Comment 57 has to deal with that Chapter 10 changes that we talked about earlier. The general licenses and the reference to other characters or material. So therefore, we had made that change. The issue, we have to step back for comment 100, just to remember, and this is a recommendation and we revised it. NRC refers to in situ mining as milling. Okay, and that's how they have their jurisdiction. They say in situ mining, the processes that they do underground is considered milling, and that's how they have their regulatory authority. The state of Wyoming calls it mining. And so there's some nuances when we communicate with the NRC that NRC doesn't have jurisdiction over mining, but we do. And so this is where that comment relates. It was just more of a clarifying and talking to the NRC through this process of existing things that exist in the state. Comment 101. There's other items within the NRC's agreement program. When we talk about byproduct material, we're talking about 11E2, which is very specific to uranium recovery operations. There's other types of byproduct material, which are considered 11E1, 3, and 4, that have to deal with other processes. Some, like for example, with accelerators and medical use, there's potentially other byproduct material created. We did not define those byproduct materials in our regulations because we felt it would create confusion as you read our regulations, because we're not assuming that type of material. NRC originally had requested that we put those items in. We explained our position, and NRC is okay with us not including those definitions in our regulations. So this comment is satisfied. Chapter 102, we resolved with the NRC. In Chapter 1, we state that the definitions that are presented in Chapter 1 apply to all the uranium recovery regulations, and therefore that comment was resolved. NRC was concerned that the definitions, there wasn't a statement that stated, for Chapter 4, the definitions presented in Chapter 1 apply. We already had that language. We just had to point them to that language that preserved that right. Comment 103 had to do with licensee, license material. All these items are category D, which means the state is able to define those. This again goes back to that reciprocity requirement. Because we met NRC's standards for reciprocity, we changed the statutes in 2017 to recognize other agreement states, and we've made some changes in our regulations to recognize other agreement states. This comment is void now and is non-applicable. Comment 104, in our regulations, again, NRC bases a lot of their actions based on guidance documents, things of that nature. Because the state, this is a new program, we felt a lot of those items needed to be included in the regulations. One of this was the definition of ore. However, based on review and NRC comments and also comments from members of the public, we have decided to remove that definition. And that definition has been removed from the regulations. It would have caused more review time by the NRC to accept that definition, and after reviewing public comment, it was the public's interest to remove that definition as well, so we decided to remove that definition. Comment 105, we had to resolve, again, this is a technicality with the definitions of byproduct material. We resolved that with the NRC by not including the 11E1, 3, and 4 in our definitions, and therefore that's been resolved. Again, and then there's some additional comments that are listed here, but we answered them in other sections, and therefore, I believe, if you go to comment 35 or 34, or comment 27, Craig, where we do special nuclear material, it's going to be page 21. NRC required that we do special nuclear material. It's a material that we're not going to be assuming as far as the state goes, but there's a lot of our definitions that state excluding special nuclear material. And because the term special nuclear material is used in places in our rules, we felt that we took NRC's advice of including this definition and we put it into the regulations. It doesn't change the intent of our regulations, it's more of a clarity item. Comment 35 is a compatibility A requirement. Basically, our definition of what a curie was did not match exactly what the NRC's was, so we changed it to match exactly. Another change, we had statute changes in 2017, and in our rules, we referenced 2016, so we changed those references to our statutes in order to reflect the current standards on our statutes. In essence, and then the last comment from NRC, I'm sorry, and thanks for bearing with me, I know this is very dry stuff, is there was concern. We have a current LQD chapter, which is chapter 11, that governs the in situ uranium recovery process for the mining and the permit to mine. There was concerns from the NRC standpoint, which regulations apply, how would the operators know? And so we added there's a clause in chapter 4 where we said in instances and this is again for uranium recovery operations, in instances where this chapter conflicts with chapter 11 of the non-coal rules and regs, this chapter shall govern. And that satisfied the concerns of the NRC. Originally, the NRC wanted us to take chapter 11 and take out all the sections that apply to uranium recovery and put those into chapter 4. And we said we cannot do that because, we already have processes for the permit to mine. And so this was a compromise that we were able to come to satisfy both parties. Okay, so that is all of NRC's comments. Pretty dry, pretty technical, pretty nitpicky, just slight changes, right? Now we're going to move to the Wyoming Mining Association. Basically, we worked with the Wyoming Mining Association in development of these rules. They were critical. Their expertise was critical in developing these rules. And basically, their comment was that they approve and are in favor of these rule changes. And we just appreciate the support that we received from this group in this rulemaking. The next comments that we had were from the Powder River Basin Resource Council. The one concern that was raised was on our fee structure and recuperating costs in a downturn economy, and how we would recuperate those costs. Again, as you recall from our Chapter 7, we are obligated by the legislature to have an X amount of budget. And so we will recuperate that budget, that it's independent of the downturn in an economy or the upwind in the economy. If our budget changes, it's through the legislature, and the legislature decides what our budget needs to do. And so we will collect X amount of fees. In the comment, just to make it clear, so we put a little equation there that just says SSDC, which is site-specific costs, NSSC, which is non-site specific costs, and indirect costs equals our legislative budget. So that legislative budget is fixed. In an up economy, we may have a lot more site-specific work. We're billing to individual operators, et cetera, et cetera. If it's a downturn economy, the NSSC term would go up to cover our budget. So basically, there'd be a lot more indirect costs in a downturn economy. Regardless of what happens, we will collect X amount of money, and that's how that process will go. And so we feel like and we'll wait at the end, we can answer more questions, but we feel that we address this concern that way. The next comment was with the public participation, making sure that there's opportunities for public comment. Our rules meet the requirements of the Atomic Energy Act and the requirements that are there for public notification and public hearings and cross-examinations, et cetera, et cetera. Again, realize that these processes are going to be a little different. We have a source material license that we will be governing, but we'll also have a permit to mine. Both are separate items, and even though they're sent in an application at the same time, they may have different tracks as far as the public hearing and the public notice process. It's important to note that there are differences. Chapter 4 outlines a process where we will have cross-examination before we initiate a decision, that we'll have cross-examination with our department head, so our administrator, and there's an opportunity for that public comment. This is different than what is required with the public or permit to mine, which potentially can require that 20-day hearing is what we call it, right? So there is two different processes going there, but we do meet that federal requirement for the source material license. NRC has reviewed and passed it, but just realize because of the nature of the beast that there may be two different tracks. That permit to mine may go on a different public hearing process versus the source material license. And then again, the last one was we'll go over the Uranium Watch comments, but they just echoed the concerns that were presented by the Uranium Watch. The next comments that we received was from the Wyoming Association of Professional Archaeologists. One of the concerns, so NRC's program is a little different than other primacy programs. So for example, with like EPA, et cetera, there's a requirement that they don't necessarily remove complete jurisdiction. They're acting in behalf of EPA. With NRC, and I'm going to read this part because maybe I can say it more eloquently if I just read this part. Agreements with the NRC are unique when compared to the other federal programs. In other federal programs, federal agencies delegate or authorize a state to implement their programs. In those situations, the federal agency still maintains regulatory authority over the program. In contrast, under this specific program, the NRC will discontinue its federal regulatory authority over the radioactive materials and activities as specified in the Atomic Energy Act. The NRC will have no jurisdiction or authority over the state license issued by Wyoming's uranium recovery program. So The concern that was brought up in this is that the state, the recommendation is that the state needed to follow those federal NEPA requirements, and the Cultural 106 requirements, because it was a federal undertaking. In other primacy type organizations, this may be the case, but NRC has came back and made a decision that agreement states do not constitute a federal undertaking, and that we have to, so in essence, we do not have to meet those federal NEPA and Cultural 106 processes. We basically meet our own state processes, our own state environmental processes, things of that nature. And this comes into play, and that's kind of the response that we had to this comment. But now, if our operations or our license is on federal land, they would still need to meet those federal requirements, but those federal agencies would be governing those processes, the NEPA process. So for example, if it was on BLM land, it would be under, BLM would underview the environmental assessments and the Cultural 106 processes. Okay, last set of comments that we received is from Uranium Watch, which is a group out of Moab, Utah. The main concern, and what we'll bring up is, and I might have to discuss this a little bit, is the term alternate feed. So at conventional mills, and we have one conventional mill in the state of Wyoming, Sweetwater Mill in up near Rollins. And then there's, this is where this typically happens, this alternate feed. It does not occur in our state currently, but in the state of Utah, they do allow their conventional mill facility to do alternate feed. And what alternate feed is there's other processes out there that when their byproduct or their waste, when they're done with that waste, may contain some uranium content. And so what this, an NRC is allowed per guidance through guidance they issued, that material can be sent to conventional mills to extract that uranium and dispose of that material as what is referred to as a 11E2 waste, so mill tailings waste. And this happens in the state of Utah pretty regularly. They accept material that has some uranium content and they extract the uranium and dispose of it. The concern that was presented here was, the state does not currently have alternate feed. Why would we include the definition for alternate feed? And, although it does not occur currently, we felt that we needed to have these provisions in place in case at a future date they needed to be in place. The decision, the review process for alternate feed still has to undergo DEQ processes. We still have to decide if it's, beneficial for that use for alternate feed, that it's compatible material to be disposed of at these facilities. There's still discretion at the department level to accept or to go against any recommendation for alternate feed. There's still processes we'd have to do to approve that. So although we greatly appreciate the comment, we do feel like we need to preserve it, and potentially we'd still reserve that discretion on our part to determine if it's a viable option or not. And then going into comment 1.2, their definition of construction, and I guess I have to back up a little. With the permit to mine and the source material license, the way that it currently operates, many times your permit to mine in the state of Wyoming is issued much before, issued before your source material license is issued by a considerable amount of time. And so what has happened is, there in NRC regulations, there's definitions of construction, what can occur and can occur before you receive a source material license. We have met the intent of NRC's definition of construction and what commencement of construction is. And we understand the concern brought by the public comment, but we feel we meet the NRC's requirements. And so what currently happens is a licensee will start constructing certain components of their facility before they get a source material license. They get exemptions from the NRC. I think that a lot of this will resolve itself once the state becomes an agreement state, because we're the same organization issuing the permit to mine and the license. We'll try and issue them at about the same time. And so this should resolve itself, that there shouldn't be this pre-construction before license is issued. But currently there's concern because this does occur in other states and has occurred in Wyoming, that there's construction before they get the license. Again, the definition of direct disposal for comment 1.3 has to deal with the alternate feed. It's a definition that's tied to that term. Although we don't use it currently, there may be instances in the future where we may want to consider these types. So it's in our regulations to preserve that right. Comment 1.4 had concerns with the definition of ore. Again, because of the comments we received by the public and the NRC, we have decided to delete that definition. Comment 1.5, we retain that definition of unrefined and unprocessed ore, and we should satisfy that comment. Comment 2.1, again, has to deal with the construction, and I think that'll be clarified once we become an agreement state, that those pre-construction items should resolve themselves, but we do meet NRC's terms and NRC's requirements as far as construction. Comment 2.2 talks about cross-examination, and what I'll say with this is we do meet the intent of NRC's decisions for public hearings and cross-examination. You know, the response goes into what is meant by the opportunity for cross-examination. Our process is such that we align with NRC and we feel we meet their requirements per the Atomic Energy Act. Comment 2.3 has to deal with the standby trust language, so basically they wanted us, they were just unclear on the financial assurance requirements. I retract a little bit, I'm sorry. The requirements for financial assurance are going to be outlined in Chapter 6 of our regulations. Also Chapter 4, where we incorporate 10 CFR 40 Appendix A, they also incorporate some of those financial assurance requirements. The comment 2.4 says that we should be aware of transportation issues that have occurred at other sites. Additionally, they want us to know, they also want us to honor any existing memorandums of understanding that that apply to our program that NRC currently has. If the MOU deals directly with the agreement states, those will still be enforced. Other than that, I think we satisfy that comment. If there's additional MOUs that we have to seek out, then potentially we'll have to. But those ones that exist between like NRC and EPA will continue to be enforced and will just be an extension by becoming an agreement state. Comment 2.5, the response to this is yes, we're aware of transportation issues that have occurred in the state. We have been on inspections with NRC at these facilities while they've been investigating these incidences, and so we're aware and we understand the significance of them. Comment 3.1 asks that we do not incorporate by reference, that we spell out each of the rules. Again, incorporation by reference is an acceptable method by NRC. We meet their intent, and it's beneficial for us to move that process. You know, we discussed the benefits and the benefits of moving to a process like this, and we felt they outweighed the other benefits. 3.2 has to deal with public documents. Currently with the NRC, any type of correspondence that occurs between the NRC and the licensee is made available on a system referred to as ATOMS, where members of the public can look and search for any correspondence that they had with that individual licensee. We recognize the importance of having that transparency. However, building a system equivalent to NRC's system would require additional funds and resources that we currently do not have. And therefore, we'll make attempts to make those documents public as requested, as DEQ currently does, but we're not going to pursue it, at least at this time, in the stand-up, a system similar to NRC's due to the resource constraints that we have. Again, comment 3.3 is similar. The request was that we put important documents on our dedicated webpage. Again, we want to, and as we have important correspondence, that is an action that we are considering and will probably move towards, is putting those important correspondence on a webpage for public access. Comment 3.4 is just a list of items that are felt need to be put on the website. Again, we'll consider this as we move forward and we have public documents, which ones we put on to the website for public access. The comment 3.5 has to deal with our fee structure and how we recuperate funds, and that we can recuperate funds to operate our program. Again, we have little control over the amount of funds we collect. Again, that's legislature driven, and we have to collect that amount for our program to run. And so I think we do cover the concern that we will not cover downturn economies or things of that nature. And I should mention too, in that chapter on fees, there is provisions, if we cannot collect those fees from an operator, what are the actions we take, things of that nature. So those are also considered in that fee chapter. Comment 3.6, again, has to deal with the ATOM system. They state that there's thousands of uranium recovery licenses in Wyoming. Again, there's not thousands. We're talking roughly about the 15 that was mentioned earlier, 14, somewhere around there. And we will make that request to the NRC that those documents be retained on ATOMs. So historical documents that currently are already on their website or on their system for our licensees in Wyoming, we'll make that request. But in essence, we cannot control NRC, and if they determine that they need to be removed, that's their decision. Comment 30.7 has to deal with an EPA NESHAPs for radon emissions from operating uranium mill tailings. This is an EPA jurisdictional item and will retain with the EPA. Our agreement state will not assume this responsibility. Comment 3.8 basically states that the commenter requests Wyoming establish a numerical emission standard monitoring or reporting requirement for heap leach uranium recovery operations. Again, we state, that we will ensure that the concepts of ALARA, which is as low as reasonably achievable, so we'll go through our processes to make sure that they protect public health and safety from the radiological side. That's our objective and that's our directive in our program to ensure this. And so we will ensure that for these types of facilities that they meet that requirement. So although that was dry, those are all the comments that we received on our regulations. We felt we have met those regulations changes. We felt that we've answered all the comments that we've received. The question that I would have for the council and commission is, do we need to go through each chapter and show you those? We've kind of already talked about the changes that we've made. We can show you, and you have those in the packet that we sent, the red line, blue line changes of how the narrative of what we just covered this last little bit, how those have been incorporated into the regulations. And we tried to show you where there was major paragraphs or sentences added, but for the most part, you have all those changes that occur in the regulations.
As long as the rest of the council's okay, I think we're good. I appreciate you going through each of those chapters and all the comments. I think it's really important as we look at becoming an agreement state and the regulations in this package. So with that, any further questions from the council for DEQ? Okay, with that, I think we will go to testimony from the public. Is there anyone who wishes to testify in support of the package? Okay, seeing none, is there anyone wishing to testify in opposition to the rule package?
Is there a third category coming?
There is, yes, yes. All right, and lastly, is there anyone wishing to speak in a neutral capacity? Ms. Anderson. Please state your name, if you could.
Sure, thank you. Shannon Anderson on behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council. So our organization comes at this from, I think, the perspective of the public. And that is that this is a huge undertaking. I think you heard, 10 chapters of rules, new staff that we've hired. We've really grown grown government to serve the uranium industry by undertaking this process. And industry, in agreeing to do this, said they pay for it. So that's why we raised the concerns that we did through the comment process. We're pleased to see the changes made, that amount will be collected up front and then rebated back if necessary. I think that's a good change, and hopefully will ensure that there are those amounts collected. But we still do have concerns, I think, just about the viability of the industry, what it means over time. So we hope this council, the legislature, and other stakeholders will really watch this program and make sure those funds are collected and taxpayers aren't left holding the bag for any aspects of this program. We'd also just like to highlight the public transparency and participation comments that we raised during the rulemaking process. And I think, as the council is very well aware, this week, there are different kinds of public participation opportunities. And it's important to have a variety of those available to the public. And NRC does that through its program. There's things like limited appearance statements where you can just write a letter. There's things like the NEPA process where you can submit a public comment. And then there's the more formal administrative hearing process that is also afforded. So we just encourage the state to consider those varieties of public comment opportunities and make sure the public has access to those as needed. The average landowner out there in the uranium, next to uranium site isn't going to be able to do a full contested case hearing. It just isn't in their capacity generally. But they may want to send a letter. So we encourage the department to really think about how you incorporate the full scope of public participation into the program. We also would just highlight the website issues and make sure that the department does commit to doing some of that. I am on the NRC notice list. It's a regular thing. I'm getting notices all the time from the NRC. Adams is a tremendous resource. It's actually how I find out about DEQ work. I go to the NRC website and I do a Google search, and I'm able to find out the DEQ documents a lot easier than I am actually for DEQ itself. So that will be a loss to the public, I do have to say, but hopefully there will be some transparency measures brought through the agency's own website and listservs and other abilities to know about public meetings, know about opportunities for public comment and participation, and also the inspection enforcement program, because that is a large part of Adams as well. Notices from operators about certain incidences at their facilities. It allows the public to monitor those. With that, that's all I have.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Anderson? Thank you. All right, DEQ, do you have anything additionally you'd like in the record?
No, I think the only thing that we probably need to discuss is how we move forward from here, correct? Right.
Would the preference be for us to vote on chapters 1 through 9, excluding chapter 10?
I think it's, as we discussed, how we would prefer to go about this is I think we just keep them together. Because if we're going to go to public comment, there was some changes based on public comments that we received that the public did not see. And so in order to be transparent, we might as well put them all so they can see the changes that were made. And
You don't know.
I don't think so. But what we potentially would ask the committee to consider is potentially having, because we would have to probably put it out for 45 days for public comment per procedures, is potentially have a special meeting in July just to rule on these and say, based on the comments that we have, that at that point we could make a ruling on these regulations. July.
Madam Hearing Officer,
End of July.
I'm not sure if this is a question for the department or for Ryan. Are we able to, what is the most efficient way to conduct that meeting? To consider those changes, you can move forward. August timeframe. Can we meet via phone? Ryan, do that. as a way to move this along. We don't have to gather as a group in person in July.
Yeah, I don't see any reason why the council could not meet via phone to vote on these.
We just potentially just have to organize a place for the public to have that opportunity as well, right?
Yeah, the councils have phone meetings before, as long as the public has the opportunity to, be a part of that process. That's fine.
Does the department feel like it
Do you have issues with that?
can organize a public location, wherever that might be?
Yeah.
You guys do the public location of that, great. I just wanted to make sure so we don't have to all
And
get
would those
together.
comments from the public only be focused on chapter 10, or would we be hearing?
I think if we put them all out, they would be all able to be commented on again. But the intent, I think, is that they've had their chance to comment. We've probably flushed out most of the comments. NRCs, we shouldn't have any comments besides the one on chapter 10, but there could be potentially other comments from members of the public that we'd have to resolve. The only thing I would mention that it would probably need to be the end of July for that 45 days, probably after we were talking about a date, Craig. It slips my mind. Do you remember off the top of your head?
Well, just,
Right.
yeah, I'm just looking at where we're at on the calendar right now. We've got 7 days or 6 days left in May, 30 in June. Just logistically, we'll have to get this notice to the paper, deal with Secretary of State's. I just would like to leave a little cushion in there.
Right. In worst case, we could move into the 1st of August,
Can I
but
ask you a question?
Yeah.
Are you considering what you're about to do, what would be kind of major amendments to what you've already done?
what would the potential change for us that could occur based on the NRC comment, right, is in chapter 10 where and you want to pull that up real quick. What's going to potentially occur in light of what NRC stated to us earlier this week is the sections that we proposed today, that red section there, is that section proposed language is either going to be deleted or left as is.
So, where I'm going is, if you're just really what you're waiting for is more comments, basically from the NRC, you're not necessarily have to close the hearing yet, which would mean you can recess the hearing, take further comment. You can, instead of worrying about the 45-day publication, you can put it out, we can notice the meeting, you can request your comments or anything. And then we can set that hearing again, and just continue having comment.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you prefer, and you want to have that 45-day comment period, within another 10 days or whatever, when responses, you can go ahead and close this meeting and reopen, and then have a brand new open meeting next week. But by recessing, you don't necessarily have to meet that 45-day, because this is already in.
Right.
So the only thing that would happen is NRC saying, well, you don't have to have it.
Right. So as much as, I think that'd be a good option, the only concern we'd have to check into is the Secretary of State and the new system that they have with uploading the information to them. And that's the only thing I don't know per se.
All I'm
But
saying is,
yeah.
you've already uploaded it, right? Yep. And so we're not adjourning, all we're doing is basically continuing the public hearing until the end of the day.
Right. If we got
So
new.
You're not closing it and then having to have another public hearing on a new set of rules later.
Right.
Which is really your 45-day, and you're going to the governor and going to everyone else.
So then if we got comment, let's say we made changes based on input from NRC, we could make those and so.
I think my only concern is that the Secretary of State has a deadline as to when public comment period closes. And to make that change, to extend the time of closure for public comment, requires notice to the Secretary of State and requires them in their new electronic system to amend that. So that's my only concern. And I guess since Ryan deals with the Secretary of State's office, I don't know if so I think we may be able to upload a new notice of intent that amends the date. I think what's important is that the rule package in its entirety goes out for another 45 days comment. Just to be transparent with the public and make sure they have an opportunity to comment on the significant amount of revisions we've proposed today.
If that's your preference and if that works with the time frame, let's go ahead and close the hearing. We don't need to vote for that, correct? Okay. And we'll look to a date at the end of July or early August. With that, I will pass the gavel back to Dr. Bagley.
All right. So, thank you. It is 10:45. We will take a break until 11, when we will return to our Brook hearing. So, 15-minute break.
I don't know the technical components of it as far as.
Reminded me. Discussing it. You know, the initial.
There's a table for like nutrient. So basically that table, especially honest, by reference. That was the issue. Yeah. I'll leave that. Yeah.
Well, that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. We need to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
You guys covered for, it says the council can extend the comment period indefinitely.
We know that, and I appreciate your comments. The problem we've had is because of the new system that the Secretary.
It's the Secretary of State's fault.
Yeah.
They have to fix it. I mean, we have been doing this and it's there. The public knows, we've noticed them already.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but we just want to make sure that, you know, we give the fair.
I'm sorry, I'm already like,
That's not something.
I don't disagree, that's just, we just want to make sure that we're, you know, going through the right procedures. No, I
Well, that's why that aside, maybe when they. So.
Really,
And that's. But if you want to.
And we are back in session. Good morning. It is 11:02 a.m., May 24th, 2017. I am Dr. David Bagley, the hearing officer in docket 17-4802 in regards to Brook Mine LLC. Present today from the council are Tim Flittner, Megan Lawley, Megan Degenfelder, Nick Agopian, and Deb Balmer. Councilman Fair Service has recused himself due to conflict. Parties present today are on behalf of Brook Mine. I will let you introduce yourselves.
Have Jeff Pope, Isaac Sussman, and Tom Sanson.
Thank you. On behalf of DEQ.
Andrew Coleman and James LeBron.
Thank you. On behalf of Powder River Basin Resource Council.
Good morning, Shannon Anderson.
Thank you. On behalf of the Fishers.
Jay Gilberts with Yonke and Toner.
Thank you. And on behalf of Bighorn Coal.
Good morning, Lynn Boomgarden and Clay Gregerson with Crowley Fleck.
Thank you. Also present for the council are Jim Ruby, Executive Officer, and Joe Gerardin, Council Business Coordinator, and Ryan Shellhouse from the Attorney General's Office. This hearing is being held at Sheridan College, room TRCC 008 in the Thorn Rider Campus Center, 3059 Coffeen Avenue, Sheridan, Wyoming. There is a court reporter present. So we ended yesterday with completing with a witness from DEQ, and I believe it is now time for DEQ to call its next witness. So please, Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. DEQ will now call Dr. Muthu Kuchiner.
I do.
Good morning. Can you please state your name for the record?
Muthu Kuchanur, Muthukuchanur.
Can you tell us what your current job is?
I am a geology supervisor in the Division Services of Land Quality Division in Cheyenne. I have been in this job for the past 5 years.
Can you explain briefly what your duties are in your current job?
I provide hydrogeologic technical support for all 3 Land Quality Division districts throughout the state of Wyoming.
Tell us a little bit about your educational background.
I have my PhD in environmental engineering from Texas A&M. My doctoral dissertation is focused on developing and applying groundwater models to optimize and balance the water usage for both economic growth and environmental protection. I have my master's in industrial engineering from Texas A&M, and my bachelor's is in mechanical engineering from India. I'm also a licensed professional engineer with the state of Wyoming.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work history?
After graduation, I worked as a consultant in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 5 years. In my everyday role as a consultant, I designed, developed, applied, and evaluated groundwater models with varying objectives, including water rights evaluation, with various objectives, including water rights evaluation and contamination mitigation for groundwater.
Do you have any teaching experience?
Yes, I do. The Office of Surface Mining has a national level training program that trains the state and federal government employees. And I'm the lead instructor for groundwater modeling with Groundwater Vistas, and that's the software that Brook Mine has used in this permit application. Also, I teach coal mine permitting hydrology, quantitative hydrogeology, and applied engineering principles for the Office of Surface Mining.
You previously testified before the EQC?
Yes, once before.
In what capacity?
I was the expert witness on, from DEQ on Link Energy Underground Research and Development License Application.
Turning now to the Brook Mine permit application. Did you review any portions of the Brook Mine permit application?
Yes, I specifically reviewed the groundwater model that's in addendum MP3. And also I reviewed the groundwater related sections in appendix D6, the mine plan and the reclamation plan.
Pull up exhibit DEQ 12. Yes, please. Page 12-183. Can you tell us what this part of the mine plan is?
This is the addendum in the mine plan that describes and documents the groundwater model that was submitted by Brook Mine during their permit application, and this is the document that I reviewed.
Have you reviewed groundwater models and permit applications before?
Yes.
How many groundwater models have you reviewed?
In the past 5 years with LQD, I have reviewed about 10 groundwater models.
During the review of the Brook Mines groundwater model, about how many review comments did you have?
There are a total of 97 review comments, and all of my comments were not resolved in one round. There were several outstanding comments. So there was some back and forth between me and the Brook Mine. There was some comment responses, interaction, and all these are documented in the technical review comments that I provided. And by the end of review round number 4, all my comments were resolved.
Related to your review of the groundwater model, can you tell us what the objective of this groundwater model is in the permit application?
The goal of the goal of the groundwater model is to characterize the groundwater impacts that might potentially be caused by this proposed mine. And one specific objective is to evaluate and identify the impacts to the water rights that's adjacent to the proposed mine.
Who created the groundwater model in this application?
The groundwater model was created by WWC Engineering, a consultant to the Brook Mine.
What did you review, or what did you do to review the groundwater model?
As part of my review, I did 3 specific items. Item number 1, I reviewed the methodology that's provided by Brook Mine in this specific addendum and ensure that this methodology is adhering to the general industry standard principles on groundwater modeling. Item number 2, I reviewed the input data that went into the model for technical adequacy and also ensure that it's representative of the site-specific conditions that we see at Brook Mine. Item number 3, I ran the model, evaluated the results out of the model, and ensured that it's technically a reasonable tool to predict the future impacts and also reasonably representative of the current conditions that you see at the site. And if I had any comments during our questions or clarifications during these 3 steps, I contacted the mine and asked for clarification as part of the technical review process.
Can you provide an overview of the groundwater model and the modeling process?
Because this is the most exciting part for me. So the appendix D6, the baseline that we discussed yesterday, provides a good conceptual understanding on where the recharge zones are, where the discharge for the groundwater is, how deep the coal seams are, and things like that. After you get this conceptual understanding, there are 8 distinct steps that Brook Mine followed in this permit application. Step number 1, selecting a computer modeling code. Step number 2, they discretized the grids for the model. And step number 3, they defined the boundary conditions for the model. Step number 4, they provided the hydrologic input data into the model. Step number 5, they did the calibration for the model. Step number 6, model sensitivity analysis. And step number 7, that's where they did the predictive simulations. And step number 8, the final step, this is model documentation. Model documentation.
Starting with step 1, and you stated that was selecting a computer code for the model. What is the computer code used in the groundwater model submitted by the Brook mine?
The computer code that Brook mine used in this application is called ModFlow. It's a 3-dimensional finite difference. It's called ModFlow, ModFlow. It's a 3-dimensional finite difference modeling code that was developed by USGS and it's maintained by USGS. It's an industry standard for modeling groundwater conditions. So ModFlow is the code, the backend, where all the calculations and finite difference equations are done. And the front end that the user interacts with ModFlow, that's called groundwater vistas. That's the software that makes it a little easier for the user to input all the stuff, all the input data, and look at the results out of the model. So groundwater vistas is the front end software, and ModFlow is the back end tool. Both these tools are pretty robust and widely accepted. So in other words, if Brook mine was not using ModFlow, I'd be asking them a justification why they did not use ModFlow.
Just for the clarity of the record, can you explain what you mean by USGS?
United States Geological Survey.
Thank you. You mentioned step 2 is constructing the structure of the groundwater model. What is involved in this step?
So you can think of this step as like pulling any of the plat maps that you have here in front of you, and then taking a ruler and drawing rows and columns. So this is the step where you discretize the whole area of interest into grids. So the reason why we do is we want to give the input data, the geologic structure into these grids to give us an adequate representation of the site conditions. So since we are talking about a 3-dimensional model, there are two categories of discretization. One is the horizontal discretization. That's the one that I said you pull your map and draw your grids into it, and that's the horizontal discretization. So in this model, if you look at from the top, so you are looking at about 164 rows and 325 columns. So that's a grid structure here. And if you look at the permit, Brook's proposed permit, it's about 4,500 acres. And if you look at the modeling domain, the extent where the grids stop, it's about 38,000 acres. So it's about 8.5 times more than the permit area of the Brook. And the model was constructed this way because they wanted to account for all the externalities and the effect of the boundary conditions that you define outside of the edges of the grids does not influence numerically what you see within the permit boundary. So that's category 1. And the second category is the vertical discretization. Now you're going to take a slice of the cross section, and then you are trying to get the vertical grids. So these vertical grids are going to represent the aquifers of the geologic units that might potentially be impacted by the proposed Brook mine. So in this, I think Dr. Bagley was getting to this point yesterday. So in this instance, we are interested in 6 model layers or 6 units. Model layer number 1, that's the overburden of the alluvium. Model layer number 2, that's the interburden unit that's going to separate this overburden and the alluvium to the coal seams. So the next coal seam that you're looking at is the Carney coal seam. And in this area, the coal seam is split into 2 coal seams depending on where you look at it. So the upper Carney coal seam is represented by layer number 3, and 4 would be the interburden or the non-coal unit, low permeable, that's going to separate the upper and the lower Carney coal seams. There is also a similar interburden that separates the lower Carney and the Masters coal seam that you're interested in. So to summarize, there are 3 coal seams of interest, the lower and the upper Carney coal seams and Masters coal seam. So model layer numbers 2, 4, and 6 represent these coal seams. And the in-between layers 1, 3, and 5, they are in general lower permeable, they are non-coal seams. So I said like initially we discretized on the top 164 by 325 columns. So you retain the same structure for all 6 layers. So the total grids that you're looking at this model is about 325,800 grid nodes.
And just for clarity of the record, there are a total of 6 model layers?
Yes.
And I think you said the first model layer was the alluvium and overburden?
Yes.
And the second model layer, I think you said was the interburden?
Yes.
And which was the Carney, the upper Carney coal seam?
That would be model layer number 3. I think I got it incorrect. Thanks, Andrew, for pointing it out. It's 2, 4, and 6 are the layers that we're interested in. So 2 would be the upper Carney.
Thank you. You mentioned step 3 in the modeling process was modeling the boundary, establishing the model boundary conditions. What are the different boundaries in this model?
So one of the critical decisions that the modeler needs to make is where do you stop modeling? Where do you cut the model off and say this is representative of the site conditions? This is representative of the site conditions. So in this instance, if you look at the bottommost layer, the Masters coal seam, the layer that's below is the Lebo shale, and that's pretty well documented. The shale is a lower permeable unit throughout the Powder River Basin. So there is very minimal interaction, if any, between the lower coal seam, the Masters, and the shale. So the model stops at model layer number 6 because there is not much interaction after that below. On the extents, on the horizontal extents, towards the northwestern portions of the permit boundary, that's where the coal seams outcrop. So after that, there is no coal seam. So they took it all the way to the outcrops where the coal seams come to the surface. And on the southern and the eastern edges of the boundary, that's where the coal seams dip and go deeper. So they used the general head boundary condition in the mark flow model to represent how water comes in and gets out in the southern and the eastern portions of the permit boundary.
Can you explain what a head boundary is?
It's so based on the observed or literature sourced information, you can prescribe these are the water levels at the boundaries. So that's one of the reasons we wanted the boundaries to be like away from the domain of or the permit boundary of interest, because we know that there are going to be uncertainties at these locations. We don't want this to be impacting in any way the domain of interest. So that's the reason we went like further away to get these boundaries in.
You mentioned step 4 on providing the hydrogeologic input data. Can you summarize the primary input data used in this groundwater model?
So until this step, we have defined the grids. We have provided the top and bottom elevation, the geologic structure into the model. So if you can imagine, if these grids are flexible, it's going to like follow the coal dip, the thickness of the coal, and how it's getting deeper once you get to the Tongue River. It's going to tell you like how far it's from the top, the land surface, all the way to the coal seam, and how deep these units are. So you got the geology into the model. So in this step is where you get the hydrology into the model. So this is where we are going to say like, these are the hydraulic input parameters into the model. So I can sort of like think of this step as the marriage between geology and hydrology. In this step, you tell the model what's the hydraulic conductivity of the units, what's the storage parameters, what's the recharge that's coming in from precipitation. You represent the Tongue River into the model. You denote the geologic faults into the model. So this is the place where you give all the parameters that represent the hydrogeology.
Is the input data you just mentioned described in the permit application?
Yes, it is. It's defined in the baseline sections, Appendix D6, and also in Addendum MP3 and in the mine plan.
Moving on to step number 5, calibration. Did Brook Mine do a model calibration?
Yes, they did.
What is model calibration?
So model calibration in oil and gas field, they call it as history matching. So this is the step where we ensure that the model has the ability to represent reality or what you see in the ground. Just want to emphasize that the model is just a representation of reality. We do the best that we can get to reality, but it's not what you see in the ground. So it's our best effort. So this is the step where we want to make sure that the model represents reality. So we take the approach of like, we also acknowledge the heterogeneity in the aquifer. We acknowledge the variability in the parameters. So for example, if we know from the field data that's collected by Brook Mine and the published literature sources, if the hydraulic conductivity varies between 0.1 and 1 feet per day, for example, 0.1 and 1 feet per day, for example. So in this stage, you're trying to characterize what's the effective parameter within this range, within this framework, that's going to give the best match for what you see on the water levels in the ground. So you acknowledge this variability and you're trying to get to an effective parameter set. What's the best recharge? What's the best fit for the hydraulic conductivity that's going to be representative of the field conditions at this stage into the model? Yes.
What is step number 6, model sensitivity analysis?
So I mentioned that during model calibration, you vary within this published framework that we think is reasonable. But in model sensitivity analysis, we take it a step further because we want to understand, we don't want to just match stuff to what you see on the ground, but we also want to understand how the system behaves. So you try to like take this up a notch and you say like, I'm going to vary this hydraulic conductivity, not just between 0.1 and 0.1 and 1 feet per day. I'm going to vary this by an order of magnitude on either side. And I want to see what's this impact on the water levels. So this is a step that helps us to understand what's the effect of these parameters and how sensitive are these parameters to the model outputs of interest to us.
On step number 7, predictive simulations, can you explain that step?
This is the step where we are reasonably assured that we have a good handle on like what's representative of the site conditions. You're going to jump from the realm of present to future. So you're like pretty reasonably sure the model represents what's at the site right now, but we don't know what's the future is going to be. So, but what we know is the proposed mine sequence by Brook Mine. So at this stage, we incorporate the mine sequence into the model and say, this is the trench number 1, this is how they're going to do over the years. And we incorporate this into the model, into the predictive simulations, and run the model into the future to look at what's going to be the impacts.
And getting to step number 8, model documentation. Where are the modeling methodology, input data, and results documented in the permit application?
Yes, addendum MP3 that you're looking at here, that's the document that summarizes all the 7 steps that the mine went through to get to this point. And I reviewed this document just to ensure that if someone wants to reproduce the results, we want to document this as accurately as we can. So reproducibility is a critical item, and all the steps are documented in this document.
Does the modeling approach followed by the mine adhere to industry standards?
Yes, specifically, I used ASTM standards, D5447, 54, okay, 5491, I want to say, but I think the next one is 5609, 5611, and 5981. These are the standards that I applied for reviewing Brook Mines application.
Go ahead and pull up Exhibit DEQ 36. And Dr. Kuchner, I'll have you go ahead and pick up the white binder on the far corner of the table and turn to Exhibit 36. Give me a moment to take a look at that.
Yes.
Do you know what this document is?
These are the ASTM standards that I used in reviewing the model.
So those are the ASTM standards you just named in your previous testimony?
Yes.
What are the significant input data to the groundwater model?
I'd like to highlight 3 pieces of information. So the item number 1 is the input data that went into building the geologic structure of the model, where you tell how deep the coal seams are, like what's the dipping rate and things like that. So that's a key input parameter. Input data set number 2, that's the hydrologic input data that went into the model, the hydraulic conductivity, the recharge, the fault locations, storage parameters. So that's data set number 2. And data set number 3, the number of wells, the wells that Brook Mine used to calibrate the model, that's data set number 3. So these are the 3 key input parameters I would think that went into the model.
For that third key piece of input data, you said the number of groundwater wells that had been drilled by Brook. Does that provide groundwater level data?
Yes, they do.
Can you summarize the data used for building the 3D structure of the model?
So this is the step where you tell the top and the bottom elevations of all the 6 layers of interest. So Brook Mine used about 300 or evaluated 300 drill holes within the permit boundary. And they used that information in building this geologic structure. So the 300 drill holes provide point location. So you're looking at 4,500 acres, and 300 drill holes in this acreage provides you an understanding of what's the geology at this point location and this point location for 300 point locations. But it doesn't tell you how to connect the dots. So how do you connect one drill hole to the other? That's where you need the judgment from a professional geologist to connect the dots and say, this is how the geology moves along the site. So the Brook Mine had like 14 different cross sections that's dispersed throughout the site, connecting all the dots, telling us how the geology flows in the site. And also they have created thickness maps, which what we call as isopack maps, to tell us what's the thickness of these coal seams. These are like different ways of looking at the same information, but it also gives a sense of reliability and confidence into the input data that you're putting into the model.
You mentioned connecting the dots. Did Brook Mine have a professional geologist connect the dots between the holes?
Yes, all the cross sections and documents that I mentioned were stamped by a professional geologist. They're stamped by a professional geologist.
And for the benefit of the court reporter, can you please spell isopack maps?
ISOPACH. Did I win the spelling bee?
Absolutely. After building the 3D structure, you mentioned applying the hydrogeologic input data to the model. What are the hydrogeologic input data that were used for this model?
There are three things that I would like to point here. Number one, the hydraulic conductivity and the storage input data that went into the model. Brookmine did an aquifer test that gave us this information for the Carney and the Masters coal seam. For Carney, they used 0.3 feet per day. And for Masters, they used 0.5 feet per day. So this is the hydraulic conductivity data, and they also calculated the storage parameters that went into the model using this field test data. And the second piece of information is the geologic faults. These faults were mapped by B. Barnum in his USGS study. So this is a published information, and they incorporated this information into the model. And the recharge, the starting point for recharge values that they used in calibration was from Driscoll and Carter. That's also a published USGS study. So to summarize, Brookmine used literature sources, the data that they collected in the field, into the model.
You mentioned aerial recharge data. Were the recharge rates applied to the project area adjusted during calibration?
Yes, they were within the range of values that's available in the literature.
Regarding the third type of input data that you noted, you said that was field observed groundwater level data. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you summarize and explain how this data was applied in the model?
Yes. So if you're in the medical profession, X-ray is sort of the thing that gives you an insight on what's happening in the human body. And for me as a groundwater person, the groundwater wells tells me the information on what's happening underground. So Brookmine has like 15 different groundwater wells in the Masters and Carney coal seam. So they used this 15 groundwater wells, the data from the wells, the water level data from the wells to calibrate. So if you look at the well that had the highest water elevation, and if you look at the well that had the lowest water level elevation, the range that we are looking at is about 384 feet. So the difference between the highest and the lowest point in terms of water levels is 384 feet. And if you look at the calibration statistics, the mean error that's noted in the model to match these 15 different wells is about 3.8 feet. So I would consider this as a robust calibration because they were able to represent the range that you see in the field within an accuracy of 3 feet.
And let me try to make sure I'm clear on what you're representing there. Is they looked at the actual measured groundwater levels.
Yes.
And then they ran the groundwater model.
Yes.
And the error of 3.63 feet that you referred to, that's the error between what the groundwater model predicted the level would be and what the actual level was measured.
That's correct.
And that's a relatively small amount of error?
Yes.
Is there an area of the mine plan addendum MP3 that summarizes the calibration targets and the residuals and statistics?
Yes, there are figures and tables that show these.
How did you evaluate, now that you've talked about what input data there was, how did you evaluate the input data provided to the groundwater model and to determine if it was scientifically credible?
So typically when I review models, and in this case, Brookmine's model, I ask myself 5 questions to begin with. One is the model, are the parameters used in the model, are they consistent with what they've collected from the field? Question number 2, are these parameters both in the field and the model, are they consistent with the published literature? And in this case, in Wyoming, we are fortunate with lots of coal mines. So I also ask, these data that's collected by Brook mine, is it consistent with the information that's collected by other coal mines? And also, I mean, we need to acknowledge that there's heterogeneity and variability in all this input data set that goes into the model. So if there's a choice between like 0.1 and 1 feet per day, for example, the previous example that I used on hydraulic conductivity, my preference is to use the parameter that's going to give a conservative estimate. In our case, we are interested in drawdown. So I'll be looking at a parameter that's going to give us more drawdown than a parameter that's going to give a lesser drawdown. So I want to make sure all the parameters are reasonably conservative within the range that's acceptable. And the last principle is the principle of parsimony. So this principle of parsimony, P-A-R-S-I-M-O-N-Y.
Can you explain the principle of parsimony?
Yes. The cornerstone of principle of parsimony from groundwater modeling perspective, it says, is just pretty much don't make the model any more complex than what's needed to represent what you see in the field, and it's warranted by the complexity at the site. Sometimes, I mean, it's easier to make these things pretty complex. So you can make it so complex that you can't understand what the model is doing. So the principle of parsimony essentially states, don't make it any more complex than what's needed. So for example, in this case, we have like 15 different groundwater wells that Brook mine used in the application. So for example, there is a model that shows that has like 15 different groundwater wells, and it has like 15 different zones of hydraulic conductivity with the expectation that that's going to help them to match each of those values better to what you see at those wells in terms of water levels, versus another model that has like one effective hydraulic conductivity parameter that's going to provide an estimation on the water levels that's of a similar match. I put more weightage on the model that has an effective parameter that represents all 15 wells rather than like distinct individual zones that have like 15 different hydraulic conductivity. The reason being that we need to remember that the model is not just a tool to represent what you see right now in the field. The primary goal is to represent or to get an understanding and evaluate and characterize what's going to happen in the future. So to summarize, I think, I mean, it's sort of the principle of parsimony reminds me that don't lose the forest for the trees. And I also would like to touch back a little bit on, I said like one of the things that I ask myself is the data that's used by Brook mine is consistent with the other information that's collected by the coal mines. So one of the things that we have in the division is a database that's a collection of all the aquifer tests that's conducted within the state of Wyoming by all the coal mines. So we have about 500 aquifer tests that's conducted by different coal mines throughout the state. I understand all these coal seams are like different. They're conducted by different companies, and there are like lots of variability in this data set over time. We have information all the way from 1970s to now. I looked into this data set and I have like a readily available statistics out of this data set. And the median for the coal aquifer out of this data set is 0.67 feet per day. So, and then the value that's used by Brook mine is 0.3 and 0.5. So that reasonably assures me, given all the variability that I'm seeing, this is like one other line of evidence that tells me that the values that we had used in this, model are within the range.
Just to clarify, you mentioned that the data was available in the division's database. Can you just clarify which division?
Land Quality Division.
I'll turn now, I have us turn now to DEQ page 12-248. And I'll just have my colleague, Mr. LaRock, also take a quick look at page 249 and 250. Does the groundwater model state the predictions that came out of it?
Yes, one of the key inputs of interest to us is the drawdown that's going to be at the wells. And these figures illustrate the drawdown at the different coal seams. The blue line, the blue contours that you see are the predicted drawdown. And the numerical value that lies on top of these blue contour lines, they show the magnitude of the drawdown. So for example, if you see a 10, just like at this location, it's about 10 feet. It's about 10 feet. Drawdown. At this location, the drawdown is about 10 feet.
I'll have us turn now to the very next page, page 12-251. Can you tell us what this document is?
Yes, this is the table that lists all the identified water rights that's adjacent to the proposed Brook mine. And it lists what's the estimated or predicted drawdown at these well locations that have a water right. So the last column that you see here that's labeled max drawdown feet, that tells you what's the drawdown that's that will be cost by mining at these well locations. So there is one value that indicates it's 25.8 feet, but everything else, all the other wells that you look at here, they're like pretty much less than 2 feet or so of drawdown.
Are these drawdown impacts mentioned on the table permanent?
They are not permanent.
Does the mine plan or the groundwater model discuss why they aren't permanent?
Yes. The groundwater model doesn't just stop at the design stage and the mining stage. It goes into the recovery stage. So after the mining is done, the model also predicts what's the time it's going to take for these wells to recover to pre-mining water levels.
I'll have us turn to page 12-258. Can you tell us what this section of the groundwater model is?
This is the section that talks about the recovery that's estimated by the model.
What does the groundwater model's estimate on the recovery period for the groundwater levels?
So if you look at these drawdowns, the maximum impact the maximum drawdown is going to be at the locations where you mine. So that's going to be the location with maximum drawdown. And once you go out from this location, the drawdown is going to decrease with the distance. So the model estimates at the locations that you mine within the permit boundary, it's going to take 10 to 20 years for the masters and Carney coal seams to recover to within 10 feet of pre-mining water levels.
Is that rate of recovery, is that different between the masters and Carney coal seams?
Yes, they are. So the Carney coal seams, it's about 10 years, and masters, it's within 20 years.
Does the groundwater model predict estimated groundwater flow that will be intercepted during the mining operations?
Yes.
I'll have us turn to page 12-254. Can you tell us what the table on this page is?
So this table predicts what's going to be the pit inflow into the Brook mine. So this tells us what's the potential or what's the possible amount of groundwater that Brook mine will be intercepting during their mining operations. So you have the year. So Brook is proposing to mine for about 12 to 12 and a half years. So this table tells us by year what's the amount of groundwater that will be intercepted by Brook mine during their mining. So if you look at this, the maximum amount of pit inflow that you see here, it's about year 7. That's about 98.9 gallons per minute. So that's the potential maximum groundwater that might be intercepted by Brook mine during mine.
Is that number applied to a particular pit? Or can you describe what that number represents?
So as we know, I mean, Brook mine is going to follow a mine sequence. They're going to mine a certain area in year number 1. They're going to move on to the second trench in year number 2, and they're going to progress and follow the sequence. So for example, if you're looking at year number 7, this tells us the cumulative impact of all the previous trenches that before year number 7 too. It's a total of all the groundwater that might potentially be impacted by Brook in year 7 based on like the number of pits that's open at the time. Based on the number of pits that's open at the time.
So that inflow represents the total of all of the inflow that might be in the pits at that time mined?
Yes.
Does the groundwater model take into account stream flow data?
The groundwater has a representation of Tongue River into it, yes.
Do you know where this that data was obtained?
That data is also represented in Appendix D6, where the mine has used some of the information from the USGS gauging stations that's available.
Do you know what, based upon the data, do you know what the average annual flow was in that data for the Tongue River?
So I think, I'd like to provide the council the context of the numbers that we are talking about. We are talking about 98.9, 100, and 1,000. What does it mean in the practical context? So if you look at the Tongue River, that's right next to this proposed mine area, we have a gauging station from USGS that tells us what's the flow in this river, and we have a data set that gives us the information for a 10-year period from 2005 to 2015. So we have a 10-year period of this information. So it's a decent data set for us to get a handle on like what flows in the Tongue River. So I looked into this data set, and the minimum most flow that's in the Tongue River during this 10-year period is 100 CFS. The maximum that I see is like 400 CFS, and the average is 200 CFS. And if I look into this table, it says like 98.9 GPM, and this translates to 0.22 CFS. So Tongue River, even if you take the most conservative case, the lowest flow that's in the past 10 years is 100 CFS. And the worst case that you look at the highest possible amount of groundwater that Brook mine will be intercepting, that's 0.22 CFS. So 100 CFS in Tongue River, 0.22 CFS from Brook mine. So there is a magnitude, 3 orders of magnitude of difference in flows here. So it's important to keep in mind, Brook mine did all this modeling work to characterize the 0.22 CFS that they are intercepting. And I reviewed this model for its accuracy for characterizing 0.22 CFS.
You mentioned the heterogeneous nature of the aquifer and the uncertainties in the groundwater model input parameters. Based on your review of the model, how would these uncertainties affect the model results?
The two output parameters of interest for us in the model is the drawdown that's going to be caused by the proposed mine in the wells that have a water right. and what's the amount of groundwater that Brook mine will be intercepting. These are the two parameters of interest to us. And both these parameters, considering the heterogeneity and the uncertainty, both these parameters will be impacted to some extent. We have to acknowledge that there is variability and uncertainty from the model in predicting these outputs of interest to us.
Considering those uncertainties, are there any additional mechanisms to protect nearby well owners in the permit application?
In LQD, Land Quality Division, over the years, we have always acknowledged when you're dealing with Mother Nature, there is always going to be heterogeneity and variability, and there is going to be a certain level of uncertainty to the outputs that you're looking at from a model. So I mean, we did the best that we could in reviewing the model, making sure it's technically adequate, it's reasonable, but there is always a potential that the model predictions may be off track. Even if the chance is slim or whatever our confidence on the intervals or on the predictions, we need to acknowledge this uncertainty and we need to have backstop mechanisms. So we need to have backstop mechanisms. So the two backs are, we have like several regulatory mechanisms that we can address these uncertainties. On the first parameter of interest, the drawdown and its impact to the adjacent water rights, we have a commitment that's required by statutes. So we have required Brook to have a commitment in the permit that says if the water rights, if the groundwater rights are impaired by the proposed mining, they need to provide a replacement source. So that's a commitment that's required by statute and it's in the permit. Item number 2, the amount of water that Brook is going to intercept. Definitely there is a variability and we need to acknowledge that. So how we deal with that is we have sort of 3 mechanisms that I can think of. One is the groundwater model in itself is not a once done sealed document. We rely quite a bit on the annual reports that the mine needs to submit to us, the site inspections, and we also require the mine to collect monitoring information from these wells during mining. So there is the during mining monitoring, there is our LQD oversight in terms of inspections and annual reports from the Brook mine and reviewing and commenting on those things. And item number 3, the monitoring doesn't stop, or the model predictions doesn't stop at this stage. We take it all the way to post-mine monitoring. So even after the mining is complete, Brook is required to monitor post-mining after reclamation.
Is that data that you just identified incorporated into the groundwater model?
Can you rephrase the question?
Is the groundwater model updated?
Yes, I would consider the groundwater model as a living, updatable tool. So based on the information that that Brook mine submits to us during mining and the information that we'll be collecting during annual reports, inspections, all this data will go into the model. And if you see any deviation from what the model has designed for versus what you see in the field, we will require Brook to update the model predictions.
I'll have us turn to page DEQ 12-064. You had mentioned a monitoring plan. Can you tell us if this document relates to that?
Yes, this is the section in the mine plan that talks about the committed monitoring by Brook. The committed monitoring by Brook mine.
What is the frequency of the collection?
We require Brook to collect quarterly.
Talking about the second regulatory control, you mentioned annual reports and site inspections. When does the Land Quality Division require the mine to submit annual reports?
It's a statutory requirement that Brook need to submit the annual report prior to within 30 days of the anniversary of the permit. So every year, prior to within 30 days of the permit approval date, they need to submit the annual reports for our review.
Does DEQ identify what information needs to be provided in annual reports?
There is a document, this is called as the coal annual report format that we use to guide coal mines to provide the information that we would like to see in their annual reports.
I'll have us turn to DEQ Exhibit 29. And taking a look at this page as well as following few pages. Is this the document that you were just mentioning?
Yes.
This is the coal annual report format?
Yes.
I guess we'll turn to page DEQ 29-014. Does this page identify groundwater data that needs to be provided in an annual report?
Yes, I'd like to highlight the statement right here at the bottom of this page that says the operator will provide a brief discussion of the data and state whether data are trending towards or away from permit projections in the probable hydrologic consequences section of the permit. So the modeling is part of the probable hydrologic consequences section of the permit. So if the data that's provided by Brook Mine during the annual reports is deviating from what's in the modeling of the modeling section of the permit, then we'll be asking Brook to provide an explanation why it's deviating and what needs to be done to update the model.
To clarify, just for the transcript, where that statement that you just read was located, was that statement in a paragraph with the with lowercase b in front of it on this page?
That's correct.
You mentioned a third regulatory control that is post-mine monitoring. Is there a commitment from the Brook Mine for post-mine monitoring?
Yes.
Can you tell us where in the permit application that's located?
It's in the reclamation plan of the permit application.
We'll open up DEQ Exhibit 13 and turn to page 13-052. Can you tell us what this part of the reclamation plan is?
This is the part where Brook commits to monitor groundwater levels and water quality post-mining.
What is the intent for post-mine groundwater model?
The intent for post-mine groundwater monitoring is to ensure that the groundwater levels and groundwater quality meets the approved post-mining land use.
How long is Brook Mine required to collect this data?
We require Brook Mine to collect this information until final bond release.
Based on your review, during the technical review of the groundwater model and those areas of the permit application that you mentioned you reviewed, did you determine that those portions of the application were technically adequate, in your opinion?
Yes.
Have you reviewed the objections filed relating to groundwater, to the groundwater model and the areas of the permit application that you've reviewed?
Yes.
Did you look at objections related to the trench TR-1 area?
Yes.
What is your understanding and analysis of the TR-1 area?
So the tier 1 area, there's a specific cross-section in the permit application that describes or helps me inform what's happening at the TR1 area. So that's the document that I'd like to point the council to show my understanding on what's happening at the TR1 area.
Okay. I'd like to open up Bighorn's exhibit number 14. Can you tell me if, is this the document you were referring to?
Yes, this is the document that I was referring to. So even though it's a Bighorn whole exhibit, I'd like to point out the map that's used here is developed by Brook Mine, and it's part of the permit application.
And you reviewed that figure during your review of the permit as well as reviewing after the objections?
Yes.
Is there anything different on this exhibit than is on the figure inside the permit application?
So there is a red line here that's marked as 3,600 feet elevation. And also I could see the red text here that shows the exhibit number.
Can you explain how this figure informs your understanding of the TR-1 area?
So I guess I'd like to point the scale that we are looking at here. Each of these intervals here, that's about 25 feet. So the darker shade that you see here, that's the saturated backfill at the TR1 area. This is a drill hole, a groundwater monitoring well that was drilled by Brook Mine during their field investigation. And so this is the coal seam of interest to Brook. This is the backfill. And then you see the Tongue River here. And the red line here that shows that's put in by Bighorn in their exhibit, 3,600 feet. That shows the water level in the saturated backfill and what's in the Tongue River. And I also would like to point out the lighter blue lines that you see here. Those are the water levels, the groundwater levels that are observed at these monitoring wells by Brook. And the white space that you see here, you can like zoom in and take a look at it, but the drill hole here shows what's in this.
Just take a moment to zoom in. Please continue.
So these are lower permeable units, the clay stone, siltstone, and there is some sandstone in here. So one of the things that it informs me when I was reviewing is I'm looking at these two water levels. What's in the saturated backfill? What's in the Tongue River? I'm also looking at like what's in the coal seam. So I see a difference of about 100 feet between the blue line that I see in the well versus what I see in the Tongue River and the saturated backfill. So I'd like to maybe simplify things. So for example, if you think like two tanks just lying on top of each other, the top tank represents the Tongue River and the saturated backfill, and the bottom tank represents the coal seam that's of interest to Brook Mine. So if you think there is a partition in between these two tanks that separate these two tanks, if this partition is permeable or porous, you would think at some point in time, the water levels will equilibrate and you'll see like one water level, one distinct water level that's representative of the entire tank. But in this instance, the fact is we are seeing two distinct water levels. One is representative of the coal, one is representative of the Tongue River and the saturated backfill. So that tells me these two tanks are not talking to each other. There is a partition in there that separates these two systems. There might be some minimal connection here in hydrogeology. We never want to say there is no connection and rule it out. There is some connection there, but the water levels indicate they are like 100 feet apart. There is the other evidence that I see in the materials that tells us there is clay stone, siltstone, and other low permeable materials. So this tells me the story that these two things are not hydrologically.
After reviewing the objections related to the Tongue River TR-1 area and the other objections you may have reviewed, and then looking back through the permit application, in your opinion, are the groundwater model and the portions of the application you reviewed still technically adequate?
Yes.
Did the objections reveal any minor technical issues that could be corrected through a permit revision after the permit is issued?
Yes, there was one issue that was pointed to our attention from the objectors on the commitment from the Brook mine to replace groundwater rights. That's one issue that I think we need to correct.
I'll have us open back up DEQ Exhibit 12 and turn to page 12-062. Can you tell us if the area you're mentioning needs to be corrected is on this page?
Yes, it's on the first paragraph, and I think here it says there is the term adjudicated water rights. We would like to remove the term adjudicated from the statement.
And what would that correction, what would the effect of that correction be?
So this correction will ensure that all valid water rights that have a permit with the state engineer's office will be replaced if they are impaired by Brook.
Are adjudicated water rights just one type of water rights?
I will not get into the SEO terminology.
But based upon your review, this correction should be made?
Yes.
Yes, just to summarize overall, do you believe, in your opinion, that the permit application is technically adequate?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. That's my last question.
Thank you. Well, I don't know about you, but I worked up an appetite for me listening to that. So it is 12:10. Let us take an hour and 20 minutes. Be back here at 1:30 to start cross-examination. We are recessed until 1:30.
Thank you.
I love this stuff.